can do it. I always say this at the beginning, but I don't plan on doing anything to myself. So if something does happen in the near future, it wasn't by my own hand. I hate that I have to say that, but I really do get concerned sometimes, especially people in the comments. Always telling me that I need to be concerned. Freaks me out a little bit more. But yeah, if you also would like to read more about this subject, a lot of the articles that the information from this show was gathered from are written in Dutch. So they're hard to translate and hard to read. But if you want to take a look through all of that stuff, there's a resources document in the description of the show. So you can go check out all the links, read all the documents, and see for yourself that we're not making stuff up here on the show. I want to thank Rebecca for helping research and write this script and bring this whole thing to life. And without further ado, guys, this is a really, really dark one, and I'd never heard of this place until somebody on one of my videos here on the Conspiracy Files commented and said, you should look into this place next. And I did, and wow. It's like every single country has a place like this. In Belgium, it's the Chateau d'Ameroy. In the United States, I mean, you got a number, but the main one's really like Epstein Island or North Fox Island. In England, it's the Guest House. There are certain spots that seem to become magnets for evil, and the Roundhouse that we're talking about today is one of those places. And as always, I want to warn everybody, this is a graphic and disturbing show, so there are going to be some unpleasant details we're going to go over, so viewer and listener discretion is advised. First, we need to look into the history of the Roundhouse. So, Frank van Vloten was a son of the philosopher and freethinker Johannes van Vloten, 1818 to 1883, who's known as a Spinoza expert and contributed to the spread of modern humanism. He received a liberal education and was not baptized. Frank's three sisters all married well-known avant-garde artists from the circle of the Tigers. The writer, Frederick van Eden, who founded the Workers' Commune Walden in 1898, was Frank's brother-in-law, as was the poet and essayist Albert Verwey. In 1888, Frank van Vloten had married Constance Lands and had two sons. They settled on the two support floors of the Roundhouse, while the supervisor and his family lived on the lower floor. Later, in 1908, Constance accused Frank of having committed adultery with a governess, which dissolved his marriage. In 1915, Frank remarried the 26-year-old Henriette Vreed and returned to the Roundhouse. There, the couple had two daughters and lived in the Roundhouse for another 10 years or so. In 1930, Frank van Vloten died, leaving his estate divided and sold, and the Roundhouse became property of Staatsbosbeheer, a Dutch forest organization, and from that point on, the home began to deteriorate. During the Second World War, the house was used as a labor camp of the Dutch Arbeidsansatz. Nearby refugees hid in the forest in a shelter, later to become known as the Verschollendorp, or Hidden Village. In 1944, a Rheinbote ballistic missile launch pad was constructed on the estate of the Roundhouse, and after the Second World War, the former labor camp became a family resort for socially weak families. And finally, in 1967, it was decided by local government members that they would demolish the Roundhouse because it had fallen into such disrepair. So, what was so suspicious and surprising about the so-called Roundhouse in which van Vloten had built? Seems like it was just a regular old house, inhabited by a regular old family. But this place was absolutely so much more than that. And now we get into the conspiracies. The first we're going to talk about is prostitution and strings. Oh my. The first newspaper reported suspicious rumors surrounding the Roundhouse in the year 1976. The first article, in Nunspeet Verwoerd, written by Dirk Scepter, had called on readers to send him photos and more information about the Roundhouse. He revealed that the eccentric Frank van Vloten had a very bad reputation, accusing him to have remarried an orphan girl of Chinese-Indonesian descent in 1911. At the time, according to this author, the bride was supposedly unconscious and only 16 years old, and according to forest workers who witnessed some of this stuff, she was treated very poorly by Frank. Additionally, Scepter in his article mentioned that after his first marriage, van Vloten was said to have lived for some time in the Roundhouse with a woman and several young girls. He was also said to have been involved with a in Nunspeet, and during the First World War was alleged to have lured young Belgian refugees to a house near Hulshorst. These girls were then sent via the Roundhouse to frontline was in Germany. Keep in mind, these girls were allegedly very young and minors. They were said to be given away as a business gift, these girls were, after a long journey from Batavia on the merchant navy to the Netherlands, and many were of Indian descent. Around 1916, the remains of an unknown girl were found in the wooded area near the roundhouse. And according to Scepter, the author of this initial article, he was told during his investigation that gentlemen in large, luxurious fur coats and top hats would leave departing from the local train from Ayersfoort on the wrong side of the train when it was dark, and later on transfer unnoticed in Nunspeet to a tram carriage that then took them to Neo-Sorel, which was a... So apparently there were these very rich men arriving on the trains in the area. They would exit the train from the wrong side of the train so that they wouldn't be seen by people that were there in the area. Then they would take like a midnight tram, a secret, carriage service to a completely undetected, unnoticed. They would do this in the dead of night so that no one could see these rich, powerful men doing these things. And according to this author, Frank Van Vloten, the guy who built the roundhouse, was supposedly forced to sell it after his first divorce. One of the drivers of the local train that those men in fur coats and top hats rode on said that his mentor had once seen a man and a woman with two little girls get into the tram in the 1890s. The children were dressed in black and wore black cloths over their faces. Author Agnes Teben of Skepsis noted in 2012 that it's possible that the children that tram driver had seen weren't there voluntarily. And reportedly, those kids had those veils over their faces not because they had been at a funeral recently, but because the adults were trying to conceal the fact that the children were drugged and didn't know what was going on. Additionally, the train driver also said that workers were sometimes forced to let their young daughters work at Neo-Sorel, and that he'd heard from multiple people that once these workers allowed their daughters to work for one night, they would never see them again. Keep in mind, we're talking about daughters that are very, very young. We're talking children working at this. In regards to that tram, that phantom midnight tram that supposedly went to the roundhouse and was pulled by a horse through the forest, Scepter, the author of that article, indicated that there were stories going around the town that were a bit like something shown in a horror film. That's a direct quote, but he claimed that no one dared to speak about it openly. They were afraid of what might happen. Scepter, the author, wrote about a system of tunnels underneath the roundhouse and about a young girl who had apparently seen something terrible happening at a well in the area around the year 1900, writing in the article that, quote, "She can never tell what she saw there at the well. She ran away and never went back to that area." End quote. Dirk Scepter, that news reporter, reported that he obtained all the information for his article from Johann Motenberg, the son of a railway engineer and the person who bought the disused tram carriage that used to run to the roundhouse. He renovated the tram and built a small railway around his house in Job, a village below Deventer. In 1968, he opened Pony Tram to Job, which was especially advertised towards children. They wanted children to come ride this tram. Now, Motenberg, the son of that railway engineer, did research of his own to find out more about the history of the tram, but he only discovered rumors about the roundhouse. Motenberg told visitors that his pony tram had once been used to transport high-ranking gentlemen to a in the area, but he didn't know any names and he didn't know exactly where they were going. In a blog about the roundhouse on blogspot.com, Motenberg supposedly also provided the following information. Quote, "It was well known that girls who were involuntarily traveling to and drugged and feared were dressed in heavy mourning, with companions dressed in mourning. It was then not surprising when they were supported or held by their arms." End quote. So essentially they were dressing up these children that had been up in mourning gear, all black with veils over their faces, to cover up the fact that they were being out in the open. And it obviously didn't raise any alarms when people saw these kids staggering and clinging on to adults around them, because they thought, I'm sure, that this was grief. These kids were going through a lot. And they were in the process of being... But we have to go back to Motenberg, that railway engineer's son's blog. For example, Motenberg reported on a cavalry lieutenant from a well-to-of family who was on an exercise on the Veluwe in autumn 1921. According to Motenberg, this cavalry lieutenant's friend asked him to go experience something together in that area, and he knew where they had to go. So they hopped onto a tram and ended up at the roundhouse in the woods, which he believed was a sex castle or with a madame that liked expensive champagne. According to this story from this eyewitness, once inside the roundhouse, they didn't find a madame, but a gentleman with a gray beard. who was allegedly Frank Van Vloot. Inside of the house, there was an iron staircase, a sort of stage. In a semicircle, there were a number of rooms without doors. The rooms were decorated in different styles, and in stiffened postures, there were young girls of different ages and races. Keep in mind, these young girls they're referring to were allegedly children. Along the blind back are wide sofas with pillows. So when the lieutenant and his friend walked in, they turned on a light in an old-fashioned decorated salon, where next to each other on a divan or couch, a dark and blonde girl seemed to lie like dolls under a white silk cloth. According to this eyewitness, his friend knew what he wanted because he immediately went for the young blonde child, and then told his friend that the other girl was his. According to this eyewitness, the young child was very nicely laid out and wasn't a day older than 14 years old. The child was wearing a pair of long, tight black leather gloves and a pair of very high-stitched, gold-colored doll shoes. And according to this witness, because he was an officer, because he had served in the armed forces, any army members or any soldiers could come to the roundhouse and these children all day and night for free. And these girls were ultimately intended to be used at large gatherings. We're going to get into what that is in a second. The girls between 10 and 16 years old had all undergone very careful treatment. I'm assuming that means like mind control treatment or drugging, whatever it was, to make them docile and okay with what was happening to them. The girls were of different races. They couldn't hardly walk. They had something called lotus feet, and the girls didn't speak. He didn't see any of the children talking. Now, that whistleblower also stated that he returned to the special house twice more during the day, a couple days later, in that same very special rail car. The dolls, as they call them, which are the children, were present in the large hunting room, during dinner in the dining room, on the terrace, and upstairs in the rooms. According to this witness, the girls were sitting or lying in fixed postures. They didn't really seem to move a lot. And the children of Asian descent only wore a kind of scarf upon their body. The other children wore silk dresses. And there were still others that were stuck in modern clothes. According to this guy, these children were treated like dolls, and they sat on their knees or lied on the floor with the gentlemen. The conversations that the men that were visiting the roundhouse had were about politics, hunting, and other topics. There was good food and good drinks served there, and money was never a discussion point. According to this guy who saw all of this, he was told that everything and anything is possible with these young girls. He was told that you can go upstairs or go into the woods with them or for a ride for the saddle, you name it. The host, the man with the gray beard, who we assume is Frank Van Vloten, the guy who built the house, allegedly told that lieutenant that he already knew that the lieutenant's preference was blonde, and said that the blonde girl was only there for a short time and that the doctor had taken away all of the legs and cloves so that her feet had become a lotus foot. So let's just stop there for a second. So that's translated from a different language, so some of that description was a little hard to get through and understand and make sense. So the roundhouse is this circular house in the woods, rendezvous. And apparently once you go inside, there's an iron staircase, and it's a circular house. So they said there are all these rooms without doors, so these just open rooms. And this guy who was in there claimed that there were like children dressed like dolls, pretty much like almost entirely, some only wearing scarves, and they were positioned in these rooms, not moving, just waiting for men to come and them. So some of the girls had sheets over them. Some of them, were wearing these scarves. They were posed. They were sitting on the floor, kneeling down. And these were all children, keep in mind, age 10 to 16 years old. And they were all being held hostage in this roundhouse. They also learned through those interactions that military men, service members, could come to the roundhouse allegedly at any time and use any of these dolls. That's what they called these victims, dolls. And I mean, that's a really eerie, disturbing story. These children are conditioned to a point that they become shells of who they were. And an even more eerie detail is that none of the children there seemed to speak at all. They were just silent, they weren't moving, but they were alive. But back to the blog. The blog also reported that regular visitors to the roundhouse were also invited to the nightly meetings in the forest, and they only invited men who had a certain future ahead of them. The blog also reported that regular visitors were also invited to the nightly meetings in the forest, and those men that were invited were men that had a certain future. So these were men that were going to be powerful in the world, future politicians, future leaders in the country in the Netherlands, future business leaders and CEOs. And they could choose to, at that point, become a member in this organization, and allegedly they were then told to a child in front of the whole group. This meant that they were then guilty in everybody's eyes that was in the group, but then they also knew that everybody else in the group was guilty themselves. So it was almost like an insurance policy. If you wanted to become a member of the group, you had to do in front of this group of men, so they all knew that you had done this thing, and they could eventually, tell people what you had done. And so you're not going to rat on those people because they know what you did, but then at the same time, you know exactly what all these other men did. So essentially, it was like powerful business leaders, and they'd come and say, hey, if you want to join this club and you want to keep doing this stuff with us, this disgusting, you have to do this thing during this like group ritual in front of all of us, so we all have ammunition against you, because now you're going to have ammunition against us. So none of us are ever going to rat on each other, because it's kind of like the concept of mutually assured destruction, where if one person launches a nuke, everybody's going to launch a nuke, and it's just going to nuke half the world. It's the same concept here, where if one person ratted, everyone would rat. So nobody rats. Kind of like no one shoots nukes. A man named Hans Schalwick went to Jop in 1971 to take a look at that old tram that supposedly transported the powerful men out to the roundhouse. And while he was there in 1971, he became very interested in Motenberg's stories about the roundhouse and decided to investigate the case further in his spare time. Motenberg, the train engineer's son who wrote that blog post that we just discussed about the witness to the roundhouse, also helped him investigate. This was just the very beginning of the Het Roon Hui working group. This was essentially a citizens investigation group, and they collected, among other things, testimonies from workers who had directly worked for Frank van Vloten, who had seen what happened at the roundhouse. Now, Hans's working group consisted of 7 people who wanted to investigate these stories, but to this day, he's refused to reveal the names of any of the other members in fear for their safety. Apparently, a few anonymous people were active on an internet forum called FOC, and they contacted this investigative group or belonged to it themselves. Once they opened up this internet forum and asked people, members of the public, for stories about the roundhouse, over 75,000 messages were posted on the forum. Historian Wilmer Tall provided a lot of criticism of this investigative group's research and received new information, and continued to be very secretive. And the mood of the general public after a while began to shift towards anti-investigation. There were historians that were coming out in public and in newspapers and everything saying, all these things are lies, these are just allegations, and the public, which was once interested in the roundhouse and what happened there, started to side with the historians who were coming out and saying, nothing ever happened, we know for a fact that all these people are innocent. And so that made this whole job a lot harder. Copies of the first 2 folders of investigative reports that this group generated circulated amongst a few journalists in the 1980s, but for a very long time, no one did anything with them. Essentially, this group of 7 or 8 citizen journalists who had dug up all of these things had gotten 75,000 comments on their posts on their forums and gathered all this information about the crimes against children that happened at the roundhouse. They had sent all this information to journalists, and the journalists essentially looked at it and just moved on. They didn't want to touch it. It wasn't until 2006, decades later, that another shocking article about the roundhouse appeared in Must magazine, written by investigative journalist Tom Biesman. Now, Tom reported that Frank van Vloten, the guy who built the roundhouse, was known in his community as the Black Devil, and that Dutroux, referencing Marc Dutroux, the monster of Belgium, who we've talked about extensively on this channel, he said that Dutroux type took place in the roundhouse. Additionally, this investigative journalist stated that Van Vloten's second wife, whom he had apparently bought from a rich Chinese man, was called Zwoordhe, and sometimes sat naked in front of his horse. Remember, this Chinese girl was supposedly a minor who had been unconscious when she had, legally gotten married to Paul Van Vloten. Now, this is a quote from the article. He said, when the Black Devil gets it on his hips, he dumps his naked wife among the workers in the woods, with the words, here, you do with her whatever you want, end quote. Now, Schalwick and Motenberg, 2 of those investigators that were trying to break the news about the roundhouse for years, are said to have heard during their investigations from a former forest worker, who told them that sometimes a mysterious black carriage would drive through the forest with girls sitting on it that had black clothes and veils over their faces. This forest worker also told the 2 men that he had never seen his 12-year-old sister again after she had gone to work at the house for one night. Essentially, remember back earlier on I told you that people were so financially strapped back then that they were forced to let their daughters and siblings go work at these or specifically the Roundhouse, and then they'd go missing and just disappear. Additionally, that investigative reporter who published the article in 2006, Bismuth, wrote that the two men, Montenberg and Schalwick, the investigators, had visited a psychic named Delius Pitt in 1980, and this psychic had confirmed that Frank Van Vloten was a sex maniac, and claimed that the old Prince Hendrik had also visited the Roundhouse to engage in deplorable acts with children. In 2009, Bismuth, that investigative journalist, was approached by Scepter, the guy who wrote the first article exposing the Roundhouse, who provided him with new information he had gotten from Canada. And so he contacted Schalwick, the other investigator from the task force, who agreed to provide material for a book that Bismuth, the investigative reporter, wanted to write. It was then announced by his publisher that his book, Het Geheim van het Rondehuit, was to be published in March 2012. But that never happened, due to a disagreement between the two. According to Bismuth, the investigative journalist, Schalwick, the investigator, didn't want to reveal from whom he had heard that Prince Hendrik was involved in the case. Additionally, Schalwick accused Bismuth of recycling the story from another one of his books, and he said that Bismuth was claiming he had investigated this thing when he actually hadn't. He had just stolen his own work. Interestingly, Schalwick, the investigator, then took all the research in the manuscript and published the same book in November 2012 with a different name, and sold all 1,000 self-printed copies quickly. After that, Bismuth, the investigative journalist, sued him. But there were some explosive revelations coming. Schalwick's book claimed that Montenberg's grandmother, who descended from Willem III, was employed by the grain merchant Jurian Jurians, the owner of New Sorel, that original that we were talking about earlier, where the teenage girls would go to work and then disappear. Montenberg's grandmother was said to have worked there as a madam, so a woman that was in control of the children, them out. And apparently they discovered that after the Roundhouse was built out in the forest, the activities with the children, all that stuff was moved out there into the middle of the forest to avoid the eyes of law enforcement or, just regular members of society. They didn't want these rich people who were supposed to be respected, even princes and possibly kings and whoever else, to be seen going to a in the middle of the night, so they moved it out to the woods so that none of them would ever be seen going in or out. Schalwick's investigative group suspected that Montenberg's mother also became involved with the Roundhouse at that same time. Schalwick also claimed that Montenberg himself allegedly visited the Roundhouse once with his mother in 1912, but didn't want to say what she had to do with it. So Montenberg was the guy who at first was helping with the investigation and wanted to, get involved and learn about what these guys were talking about and share some of his knowledge and act like he was, eager to expose this stuff. But as the investigation went on and on, they started hearing that Montenberg's own family members were some of the people who were running the Roundhouse itself. This is all alleged, by the way. I just want to state that again. Now, the working group or investigative group heard that same thing later on from an unknown woman from a village in Twente, to whom Montenberg is said to have told the same story when she visited his pony tramp. So apparently this guy Montenberg told another woman the same thing, that his mother helped run the operations at the Roundhouse. But for some reason he failed to disclose this to the people he was working with to expose the Roundhouse. But there's a reason why. It's because Montenberg's mother allegedly was pure evil. You see, Montenberg's mother is said to have brought in foreign prostitutes to the Roundhouse who were ritually But what's interesting is that through conversations that the investigative group had with former workers of Frank Van Vloten and their relatives, it seemed that Frank wasn't an especially evil-seeming guy on the outside. He behaved somewhat unconventionally, but a lot of these people who had worked for Frank back in the day and their family members had somewhat decent memories of the guy. They told the investigators that Paul Van Vloten had helped many workers find work and that he paid them a lot better than others did. And for a while during the divorce, when Paul Van Vloten was in financial trouble for a while, some of his workers even offered to continue working for him for free for the time being because they loved him so much. However, the religious workers did find it terrifying that he regularly swore, which is a funny little detail. Now, in chapter 3 of the book that was published about the Roundhouse, there was a newspaper article from 1980 that read, quote, "In the New Sorrel," that was that brothel, "there were always more women and girls, even very young. Not all girls volunteered here. A forester with a gun guarded the house. They were there for the benefit of Jurian and his guests, a group of hunting friends. Those were very rich gentlemen, also from politics. Many of them, the rich men, never worked. Hunting, drinking, drugging, going to the throwing money. After hunting with floaters and visits to the new soil in between, the evening continued at Hotel Smith, now Itman, where there was a lot of drooting. The owner, Mr. Smith, thought it was all fine. He received a royal financial compensation, end quote. So that newspaper article is basically discussing that this rich family man and a bunch of his very rich friends, some Nepo babies that, grew up rich and never had to work a day in their life, they would all go visit that in the town that the roundhouse was outside of, and they would drink all night. The prostitutes and the children that were there, and then they would go to the hotel that was nearby and continue doing all these terrible things, sometimes even bring children into the hotel with them, and the owner of the hotel just thought it was fine. He didn't really bat an eye because he was receiving a lot of money for his silence. Additionally, the book mentioned a man named Anton Kroller, who claimed that he had found his own hunting paradise in De Haute-Veloux, which was an area nearby. The book stated, quote, "Everywhere they were hunted. Dirk, if only it was possible, from the party. From seal hunting on the Wadden Sea to bear hunting in Eastern Europe. The roundhouse was also visited several times for hunting. For the sake of clarity, hunting to these men meant hunting, drinking, drugging, and women." End quote. So these men would go to the roundhouse, they would drink, do drugs, and women and children. It was like their big thing. I don't know why in every conspiracy like this, there's like this hunting angle, kind of like at the Chateau d'Amroy. They had these hunting parties with children. Here's another place where there's a tie-in between hunting and child. I think it's because it's like one big game to all these evil people. But the book also included a testimony on page 37 by an anonymous worker coachman, who, as a coachman, brought high-ranking guests to the new Sorrel. His quote in the book reads, "Arriving at the new Sorrel, I got a good tip from those gentlemen. In that house were girls, beautiful girls. They were not allowed to leave there. That's how it was then. A Mrs. Burgers also lived here. She was the boss of those girls. No one was allowed to come there. Additionally, on the grounds of the Ronde-Huse, or roundhouse, spectators have found many large holes that appear to lead to specific passageways. It was thought that they were somehow used or part of an intricate tunnel system underneath the house that was likely a part of..." End quote. Interestingly enough, you can see one of those passageways in the following clip. Let it roll.
"It shall be done." Very well. Must be paid well for this. Armored.
Now, that's a little creepy, isn't it? That hole in the ground leading to a tunnel system which, in my mind, connected the roundhouse to other places in the area. Could it have connected the roundhouse to that? I mean, to summarize all this information up, there was basically this in the town that was guarded by armed guards. People testified that these rich men with fur coats and top hats would show up. They would secretly be taken on this special carriage to that. They would be, allowed entry into there. Inside of the were children. They went to work there. Some of them went to work there because they were destitute. Others were, there. But once they were inside, they were never allowed to leave again. Then eventually was moved out to the roundhouse, and the roundhouse is out in the middle of the woods. There's a tunnel system underneath the home, and allegedly there were also children that were there as a part of the things that were happening. That's according to direct testimony from so many different people that are involved. But that's just the very beginning of all of this stuff. It's going to get so much darker. And keep in mind, this is all just conspiracy still. This is just another debunked story that apparently never happened. There's nothing to any of this, according to the government in the Netherlands. So now that you've got kind of a basic idea about the roundhouse, we need to start talking about some of the bizarre and disturbing allegations of things that happened there, like weird phallic activities. Now, many workers who worked in that area around the roundhouse reported seeing strange activities that occurred on the land around the roundhouse. Entire hills were dug up to be rebuilt a little bit further away. Rice fields had to be constructed, but rice was never grown there. Large quantities of loam, sand, and lime were also transported out to the roundhouse without anyone ever being told what they were for. They were essentially getting all of these materials delivered to the roundhouse, then then when the delivery men would unload the stuff and, meet the people that were paying for it, the owners of the roundhouse and the people running the place, they'd ask him, what are you doing with all this stuff? Like, this is a lot of sand and lime. They'd say, oh, don't worry about it. We got it handled. And there's still, to this day, no explanation officially as to what all those materials were used for. Well, one possible explanation is that Frank Van Vloten, the man who built the roundhouse, was appointed by the provincial executive of Gelderland as supervisor of agricultural test fields and carried out agricultural experiments in the area. Lime could have been used to fertilize the soil, although the investigative group suspects that it was quicklime, which is usually a material that's used to make corpses rapidly disappear. Hills were possibly sometimes dug up to be able to lay a railway line to a place where people wanted to cut wood. And for this, separate sections of narrow gauge railway were used that could be pushed together. The working group or investigative group, however, was convinced that many of these activities had something to do with dark rituals. That would also be the reason why Frank Van Vloten had the roundhouse built near the Mistibos in the forest, a crescent-shaped rampart, which was mistaken for an old Germanic meeting or court place. In 1938, the roundhouse was investigated by the Leiden archaeologist Franz Christian Birch, who later joined the SS, or the Nazis. However, he couldn't find any trace of Germans or Germanic culture. This bizarre pit on the property remained on the monument register for a long time, but in 1997, after some investigation, it was established that this was just a natural phenomenon. It had nothing to do with an ancient Germanic culture that was worshipping something. This area had come to be how it was completely by nature. Interesting. Now, in the late 1970s, investigators discovered a strange trench in the forest surrounding the roundhouse, almost a mile southeast of the former home. A well had also been dug nearby, and it seemed like an attempt had also been made to dig up a stream or spring to get water flowing into the area. However, the investigative group had the strong impression that that excavation was supposed to represent a 60-meter long... Not kidding. Later, a depiction of the Cerne Abbas giant carved into the chalk hills of Dorset was discovered in the Birch's archive. This figure is 55 meters long and shows a naked man holding a club with an erect that's 7 meters long. The giant appears to represent the Greek hero Hercules and is believed by some to be ancient. However, he was only first described in 1694 and may have been intended as a parody of Oliver Cromwell, whom his enemies mockingly referred to as England's Hercules. The investigative group preferred to associate that giant with an ancient fertility cult and assumed that Birch had not accidentally kept him on his file on the Mistee. So it's weird. The government is claiming that there was nothing to this ancient kind of ritual ground that the owners and people who visited the roundhouse, place stake in. They like to visit that part of the property. They were making excavations around there. He said that it was nothing. There was nothing to do with it. It was all just, nature, and these people weren't doing anything weird. But in his file about that area from the official investigation, they had that picture of the giant with the huge that looked a lot like what was found in that area at the roundhouse. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. You see, the phallic-shaped excavation could be a part of a larger geoglyph. The most famous one of these is the Nazca Lines. You probably are familiar. However, the group did succeed in recognizing a gigantic image of Woden in the landscape, formed by paths, dikes, ditches, vegetation, etc. And that explained the strange activities that the workers spoke about. So they did find a geoglyph from above, which is insane. So the people who built the roundhouse, in the late 1800s, 1900s, those people constructed geoglyphs of these weird mythological creatures and beings. Huge pieces of artwork that could only be seen from the sky, including this one of Woden. So is it really far-fetched that they may have tried to construct a geoglyph of a gigantic, erect, a giant with a huge in the land? You see, from an aerial perspective, the location of the roundhouse and the surrounding property has been compared to the likes of the Eye of Woden. The Eye of Woden is based on a Norse myth in which Odin gave up his other eye to drink from the source of wisdom, although the eye in relation to the house is placed somewhat oddly. Now, Woden's mustache and beard are formed by a conifer forest. The driveway to the roundhouse is an eyebrow, and a cycle path is supposed to represent one of his legs. The image of Woden looks like a primitive child's drawing, but it's especially surprising that Woden appears to have a very small in relation to his body length. Unfortunately, the investigative group does not show how you can project Woden onto an old military map. Nothing seems to be correct. In response to this criticism, an anonymous member of the investigative group stated on that forum that even his 8-year-old nephew had managed to draw Woden onto a military map after just an hour of trying to do so. But despite repeated requests, this drawing was never revealed or shown. When the investigative group searched the area around the roundhouse and around that shaped excavation with a metal detector, they recovered about 10 glass honeypots near the pit. The lids on the honeypots had rusted through, so at that point they were full of forest soil. Shulkwick, one of the investigators, then stored them in his garage. Only later did it occur to them that, given their location, they probably represented drops of and might have been filled with the blood of children or from participants in a ritual. A business associate of Shulkwick was willing to analyze the contents in his laboratory. He took those honeypots and he wanted to see exactly what had been inside of them. Unfortunately, Shulkwick then went back into his storage and discovered that those honeypots had been lost. They simply disappeared, and he didn't know what happened to them. So to sum all that up, I know this is kind of a heavy one. They found that area which seemed to be a giant that was excavated in the ground. They found these honeypots around them, which they assume contained, materials, whether you want to call it in blood, like fluids or whatever, from these rituals. Either all of these men that were these children would then finish in these jars and bury them to seal whatever magical powers, were in that, or they would collect the blood from their children victims and seal them and place them in the ground. And there's like this giant geoglyph, like the Nazca lines essentially, over the roundhouse area, and it's supposed to be like of Odin and the eye and everything. So there was like some magical properties to this property, things that Van Vloten and those people who constructed the roundhouse and worked the roundhouse had allegedly wanted to build. But why would they be doing all this stuff? Why would they be collecting materials like that? Why would they be carving huge into the ground? And why would these allegations even make sense? Well, we have to talk about the supposed occult rituals that happened there. The idea that the roundhouse was an occult center where dark rituals were performed arose from the influence of Jan Eldermans, who died in 1985. Johann Montenberg, whose mother allegedly was the madam at the original, who helped bring those prostitutes and children out to the roundhouse to be had regular contact with Jan Eldermans from 1978 onwards, and he also had contact with Hans Shulkwick, who interviewed him frequently and made use of his knowledge. Now, Jan Eldermans worked for many years at the Ministry of Justice in the Netherlands and held a high position there, and in his spare time, he was involved in investigating occult matters. When he died, Jan Eldermans' estate showed that he was particularly interested in magic, and was probably also a member of a society that was actively involved in it. There's documentation, according to the Working House group, that investigative group that was taking a look at the roundhouse, which indicates that in a conversation with Montenberg, Elderman confirmed that, quote, at the roundhouse, people practiced a Germano-Celtic cult in which took place, and children of about 10 or 12 were held against their will, end quote. It should be noted that Jan Eldermans' parents had a holiday home built in Nunspeet, nearby the roundhouse, in the year 1920. When he was there as a youth, he came into contact with someone who told him a lot about gnomes. Yes, gnomes, the short mythical creatures. Although Jan Eldermans wasn't convinced of the existence of gnomes and never saw one himself, he then began collecting folk tales and testimonies about gnomes from that time forward. Real accounts from real people who claimed they had seen and encountered these things, stories which depicted these gnomes as not always being as benign as they are in children's stories. Jan also knew a lot about objects and rituals that were needed to attract or ward off gnomes. Before his death, he went through and destroyed many of his thousands of pages of notes, images, and self-made drawings from his research. The working group, the investigative group, suspects that Jan wanted to prevent unskilled people from performing the dangerous occult rituals that he described in his writings. Approximately 2,500 pages and 187 objects were preserved and donated by his son-in-law to the Museum of Witchcraft in Cornwall. This collection shows that Jan Eldermans had a fascination with the phallus, which could explain why the working group or investigation group thought they had discovered a phallus in the forest around the roundhouse. Jan Eldermans additionally confirmed that he had visited Frank Van Vloten as a young man and met with him. They had talked about old Germanic rites rites and customs, including rituals. Jan Eldermans, at the end of his life, claimed that he thought that the roundhouse was an occult building, although, according to others, Frank van Vloten had been inspired by a house he had seen in Spain. Jan Eldermans had heard that there was a pan-Germanic movement in Germany that assumed that the famous Battle of Varus that took place in 9 AD hadn't taken place in the Teutoburg forest, but near the Misty on the Vlu in the area of the roundhouse. To give you some context, during that battle, German soldiers hacked thousands of Roman soldiers to pieces. It was an absolutely gruesome, bloody mess, and some of these soldiers were sacrificed to Wodan, the mythical god. And remember, Wodan is supposedly the thing that is depicted in the glyph that's on the grounds of the roundhouse. So all these stories are connecting. They believe that this battle where thousands of men were slaughtered and sacrificed to Wodan took place near the roundhouse, and then there's this glyph that is appearing on the roundhouse property that looks exactly like Wodan, and apparently Frank van Vloten had conversations with this guy when he was younger about this Germanic movement and how there was like German influence and blah blah blah, and these were German soldiers that slaughtered these people, and then there's the German, thing and that German supposed ritual grounds where they uncovered those honeypots. There's just so much here. I'm sorry if this is a little confusing. It's really bizarre. It's really bizarre stuff. And in addition, going with this German concept, there was also a Germanic holy line running through the area right near the roundhouse, comparable to a ley line. If you know what a ley line is, it's essentially like a line of energy that runs across the world, and there are a lot of areas where these ley lines intersect, where there are incredibly haunted locations, paranormal wise. So a Germanic holy line is essentially like a ley line. It comes from mystical texts, and there was a ley line going right through the roundhouse property, and that's not by chance. Jan Eldermans also found that it was not implausible that Frank van Vloten had built his house, the roundhouse, on behalf of an occult Germanic society. The location of the roundhouse was very suitable for this Germanic society's rituals. According to the investigation group, Montenberg's birthplace was also on top of the holy line. He was born directly on top of the line. This could explain why his mother became involved in these Germanic rituals, perhaps as a high priestess. Now, when this investigative group confronted Montenberg with all of this evidence, he blushed and refused to talk to them, which the working group interpreted as being on the right track. It's almost like they had called him out right to his face, and he was almost a little bit scared or nervous about what they might call him out on next. They were getting deeper and deeper into the truth behind the roundhouse, and he didn't really like it anymore. Now, in Schalkwick's book, there's an eyewitness account of a ritual that's said to have taken place at a small lake near the excavation site during the First World War. According to the book, this eyewitness account was written down by a painter from nearby Nunspeed, who heard about it from somebody else. The informant saw a number of young girls on the shore in the evening, standing in a small semicircle with kerosene lamps. In front of them stood a sturdy woman that looked to be around 40 years old. All the girls and the woman raised their right hand with 2 fingers up. It looked like an oath-taking, and there was also eerie singing in the background. Suddenly, a number of men walked up to the girls from the forest. The eyewitness was shocked and ran away as quickly as possible. The investigative group also reported that the participants were imitators of J.J. Bakofia's theory of civilization, which consists of the following information. In phase 1 of this theory, members came strongly to the practices of what also happened on Epstein Island, and what the Cosmikers sought with their worship of the Eros, a great orgy, take everything you can of cross-border behavior. Quote, the first was that of haterism, or Aphroditism, a stage of sexual promiscuity and social anarchy very close to the original state of nature. During this stage, humans lived in swamps without any legal and ethical obligation, and women suffered complete domination by every male component of the horde. End quote. Those who want to live closer to nature loose, uninhibited by moral laws. In response to this, the gynocracy would have arisen, a matriarchate with a lunar cult that worships Demeter, succeeded by a Dionian era, ecstasy, and then the patriarchate. Bakofen sees that the Apollonic Greek sun god, patriarchate, elaborated in the Greco-Roman legislation and then Christianity. The victory of spirit over matter, of culture over nature, of reason over instinct, but also of arbitrary power over freedom, or social hierarchy over communal unity, or violence over peace. So it's basically explaining that the people who were into this theory, I know that was a lot once again, but they were into an almost anarchistic way of life, total uninhibited sex and dominance and hedonism and, control and power. And they believed that, some of them believed that living life like that, taking what you want when you want it, doing whatever to anybody to get power and live as, freely as possible, that's what they believed in. And so, obviously, going out to the roundhouse in the area that's completely in the middle of nowhere, that's guarded by lots of armed people, and doing rituals like this by the river or the lake, essentially being able to live life like this, it makes a lot of sense. In addition, Frank Van Vloten, the man who built the roundhouse, all of his sisters all married important artists from the Tack Tigers, a group of individuals that were somewhat infamous, including psychiatrist Frederick Van Eden, who founded the Walden Commune, and Albert Verwey. There was also a man in this group named Louis Couperus, who was infamous for his published seance book, Distill Crocked. But that last connection between Frank Van Vloten and the man Albert Verwey is one of the most interesting in this entire story. As already described in the story, in England about the Avalonians and the revival of Glastonbury, Spiritism lived strongly at the end of the 19th century, and with it also the interest in pre-Christian religions, kind of like paganism, with the founder of Theosophy, Madame Blavatsky, as the Spiritist pivot. And through this movement, the Aryan symbol, the swastika, was brought within the occult groups of that time. A group that carried that logo long before the Nazis were the Cosmiker from Schwabing, or southern Germany, where, in addition to biocentric philosopher Ludwig Klages, also Albert Verwey was affiliated, the husband of Frank Van Vloten's sister. And then comes the connection. Ludwig Klages is the writer, in 1913, of the founding manifesto of the German Greens, Mensch und Erde. Author David Cronin, in a 2024 article by the Electronica Intifada, points out that the German Greens, or the German Green Party, had a strong connection to the beliefs of the Nazi Party, citing the commonality between both strong attachment to nature, blood and soul, and men and earth, or the manifesto mentioned above. So essentially, through marriage, Frank Van Vloten was associated with an infamous, almost, I don't know if you want to call him a sorcerer or what, but a guy that was heavily involved with a German ritualistic occult group. And that's what the crux of all these theories is about, is this Germanic sort of ritual and worship that took place on the roundhouse property, the worshiping of children to appease these gods and to gain power, living hedonistic lifestyles and, and taking whoever you wanted, men, women, children, the geoglyphs that were carved into the ground that had supposed, relations to famous German massacres that took place supposedly in the area. I mean, there's so many connections here. And then you have all the eyewitnesses, people from the town who said that, my sister went to go work out there and she never returned. You have the eyewitnesses, people that supposedly visited there and saw all these children that were I don't even know exactly what had been done to them, but they were called dolls because they didn't move, they didn't talk, they were just sitting there basically waiting to be used time and time again. All of the materials that were brought out to the roundhouse that were never explained, what they did with all of them, all the tunnels and passages that even to this day people have discovered that exist in the roundhouse area. Weird, right? But to be fair, we have to point out a couple of the inconsistencies that people discuss when it comes to this story. Now, if you'll remember, the first article that was published that really broke the story was the article published by the man with the last name Scepter. His article, obviously, when it was published, was heavily criticized, as these articles always are. Any whistleblowing article or program is going to be criticized by those in power, especially those, in the press or in the political world. And people claim that, the rich people did get off on the wrong side of the train so that they wouldn't be seen, but they did so because they didn't want to walk around the entire train. They wanted to just get off on the correct side so they could leave, which I guess, you could make the argument, but that explanation completely discounts all the stories and eyewitnesses and people who actually brought these men in this dark, cart, not only to where the kids were being held hostage, but also out to the roundhouse. They also claimed that there were Belgian prostitutes in the area during the war, but they said that they were in the Nunspeet refugee camp, not in that. Which, again, how do you know that? It just ignores all of the eyewitnesses and people who've testified about this stuff. Scepter, the author of that article, also said that after the article was published, his own mother received death threats because her address was published at the bottom of the article. And he also claimed that people allegedly tried to kill him by cutting the brake lines of his car. He then wrote a second article trying to appease people, correcting some of his so-called mistakes, but the article was never published. And the anger from locals and people in the higher up of the government government got so strong against him that he actually had to flee to Canada to find safety. People were threatening his life every single day for exposing this truth. However, Shalkwick, that investigator who previously worked at a bank, told a journalist from newspaper Distintor that there were many untruths circulating about the Roundhouse. He said, "There's no network." He said that the women involved were actually foreign prostitutes. He also claimed that Frank Van Vloten had never rode with a naked girl on his horse and that no human remains had ever been dug up at the Roundhouse. He said there was no traces of an underground tunnel system in the forest, and he also said that he didn't believe that Scepter, that author, had been threatened. Additionally, there were several misreports from Shalkwick and his working group, along with a lack of evidence regarding the information they claimed was solid, according to a 2013 article by Agnes Tebet. When asked about the occult group that was active at the Roundhouse, Shalkwick and his work group were unable to answer. The question was asked at a presentation of Shalkwick's book by none other than Theo Pagimans, who was a historian who specialized in occult societies. After being asked the question, almost no information at the time about the rituals was provided. But there's also one interesting piece of information here that led that investigative group to believe that there were indeed ritual that happened on the Roundhouse property. And the evidence that they discovered that led them to believe that is pretty interesting. This is a quote that they discovered somewhere along their investigation. It said, "The dark forces were called upon to bring about the German victory at the front in France." This is referring to World War I. However, when the German armies were finally defeated in November 1918, it was clear that the experiments at the occult testing ground in Nunspeet had failed, and they were therefore stopped, end quote. So they're basically saying that some of these rituals, if not all of them that were happening at the Roundhouse, were supposedly being done to bring forth a German victory in World War I. They were these children and committing these atrocities against kids, having with minors and doing all of these things out there as a part of some mass ritual at a, experimentation ground to try bring about a German victory in World War I. But when they saw that Germany lost the war, they gave up on the rituals and tried to conceal all of the evidence that they had ever happened in the first place. And this is interesting. You remember that forum where they had 75,000 comments and people talking about what they had heard about the Roundhouse and the rituals that happened there? Well, one interesting story came forward about that psychic that I discussed before named Delius Pitt, who went into a trance at the lake on the Roundhouse property in March 1980. Delius had been brought out to the lake by investigators. He went into this trance, and this was before a lot of this knowledge was even known or understood. But the psychic, during that trance, appeared to have seen almost exactly the same thing that the witness saw in the book. The psychic was standing by the lake. This is before the eyewitness's account had been gathered and fully published, and he claimed that he saw a group of young girls, holding their arms up, men surrounding them. He saw essentially what the eyewitness would later go on to say that he had seen. But his account wasn't published, so there's no way that either of them, if you get what I'm saying, knew what the other one had said. Like, the psychic's report wasn't published, and the painter who actually physically claimed he saw this stuff happen, his account hadn't been published either. So they were corroborating each other in these weird psychic ways. And according to people who knew members that were in that investigative group that were taking a look at the Roundhouse allegations, that psychic played an important role when the investigation had stalled in 1980. They consulted this psychic, and he frequently told them where they should look next, where new information could be found, and he could tell them stories about the house that nobody had ever revealed before. And oftentimes when they followed up on these leads from the psychic, they would indeed find information, or these stories that he talked about, years before, they would eventually talk to a witness who would confirm that that exact thing had happened. The psychic also claimed that he knew when a witness had not revealed his true colors and had to be questioned again. So this psychic would be able to tell when people were lying to the investigators, and he would tell them, you should go re-ask this person the same questions and demand that they tell you the truth. Then the group would go re-investigate, re-interview the same person and tell them that they knew they were lying, and they'd tell them the truth. Really weird stuff. However, the book that was published mentions nothing about the psychic at all. This is just all information gathered from other reports. It's really weird. And the role of Prince Hendrik, who was alleged to have participated in the things that happened there, also remains unclear. The only evidence is a virtually illegible note that was found with the notes from the grandfather of a woman who had been contacted in 2006. Montenberg, one of the original guys that had been talking about all this, and if you remember, Montenberg's mother was supposedly the in helping procure prostitutes and children for ritual He had already given a vague indication in this direction a long time ago, indicating that a prince had been involved with what was happening at the roundhouse. The grandfather had recorded a conversation with a certain person named H, who reported on a murderous ritual. Now, for some reason, the investigative group has still to this day not talked about this ritual in detail. They haven't revealed what the ritual allegedly entailed, but they have stated publicly that they wonder if the H on that note that talks about this murder references Prince Hendrik or Highness. Could the prince have been involved in a ritual for some sort of security reasons? Could he have wanted to attend a ritual at the roundhouse because he thought it could help them win a war or help him gain more power? Or was the prince one of the members of the ring that was operating supposedly at the roundhouse? Or if you'll remember, towards the beginning of this episode, we talked about how allegedly all of the powerful men who were there at the roundhouse would go out for a nightly ritual where the one man would do something to a child or a woman in front of the other men, and that would be some sort of an insurance, policy to make sure that no one ever ratted. Could the prince have taken part in that? Could he have done something to a child in front of this group of other powerful men? And that's why the truth about him was never revealed, or he never revealed any truth, because he's, essentially blackmailed or compromised? I don't know. At the end of the day, even though this story has been debated very, very widely in the Netherlands, and some people believe that it's true, others don't, I genuinely am from the camp, obviously because I host the show, that a story cannot grow and proliferate if there's no truth to it at all. Like, where would all these allegations and rumors come from? And it's always so easy to write something off as being so fantastic or unbelievable that there's no way it could be true. But there's always truth to these stories. I mean, think about all of the eyewitnesses that I just went into detail with you about. The people who claim to have visited the roundhouse, who saw the children dressed as dolls and wearing these weird things not moving. The eyewitnesses who saw rituals taking place on the lake. The psychics, whether you believe in psychics or not, but the psychics who saw things and received messages about things that ended up being alleged later on. And all of the glyphs that were seen, on the property, the supposed gigantic that was excavated, all the honeypots and all of those weird items and things that were discovered buried in the ground, the allegations of children being forced to work in these and never being allowed to leave, the whispers in the local town about the powerful men that would take the hidden tram to the roundhouse or to other areas. I mean, there's so much information here that, as I always say on this show, when there's smoke, there's usually fire. And I don't know. It's just crazy to me. It's crazy to me that things like this could have happened. Usually we hear stories about rings like this that were in operation in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, but more of a historical ring like this back in the early 1900s is crazy to think about. That there is probably so much history like this around the world in every single country that was just completely covered up and will remain covered up because it's just so unbelievable. And back then, I mean, if you didn't keep a record of something, who's going to remember it or talk about it? If Epstein, a person like Epstein who was children, happened in 1910, they easily could have every single person involved, and they easily could have gotten away with burning every file. It was before investigative authorities and investigative bodies and agencies were even, a thing. So there was no database of information. There was no place to store information about stuff like this. But as always, let me know what your thoughts are about this story in the comments. This was a pretty crazy one, and I believe it. I believe that there's some definite strangeness and shady that happened at the roundhouse. What about you guys? Just let me know. If you're watching on YouTube, let me know in the comments section. And if you're listening, please be sure to leave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps if you guys comment and interact with, whether you're listening to the podcast or you're watching it. It helps so much. And it's also great to hear from everybody. But until next Wednesday, you guys have a great rest of your week. Thank you for joining me. Don't forget you can check out my other podcast that I co-host with Courtney, Murder in America, or my main YouTube channel, The Paranormal Files, if you want more documentaries. Keep that tinfoil hat on, question everything, and I'll see you next time.
Calm down, everyone, please. I assure you that everything that can be done is being done.
Capitalism is over. So what comes next? techno-feudalism. Now, if that sounds sinister, well, yeah, it should. Techno-feudalism describes an economy that is slowly regressing to medieval times, where we're becoming serfs tilling the digital land owned by our Silicon Valley feudal lords. And the end game of this project is replacing democratic governments with privatized and non-democratic digital spaces. One tech billionaire is already ahead of the curve in making this vision a reality.
This is what victory feels like.
I mean, come on, you had to see that one coming. Who was surprised with that? It's always him. It's always you, Elon. The world's richest man has been hard at work manifesting this dark, new post-capitalist order. He announced his support for a German far-right party in an upcoming election and agreed with their leader that pro-Palestinian activists are basically Nazis. He accused the leader of the British Labour Party of covering up large-scale sex crimes and then argued that the US should liberate the UK. British friends, shout it out in the comments if you want me to come liberate you. I'll be on my way. And he's been acting like Trump's assistant regional manager, living in a $2,000 a night Mar-a-Lago bungalow and running a made-up government agency. Oh, and he's also using the social media platform that he owns to do hate speech. Now, it's easy to attribute this bizarre behavior to general billionaire megalomania. But that risks missing the point. All of his actions connect to the larger project of using digital space to subvert governments and command increasing control over our lives. Okay, so what is techno-feudalism, and how are folks like Musk using their influence to push not just the United States, but the entire world in this direction? Now, to understand, I first need to talk about feudalism, which is a pre-industrial system in which you were either born landed gentry, meaning that you owned land, or a serf, meaning that you worked the land. And because land was something you inherited, there was no way to climb the ladder from serfdom into gentry, no bootstraps in that world. There was no market price on the land. But with economic changes in the 19th century, land became a more valuable commodity on the emerging market. So landlords kicked the serfs out and invited them to come back and exchange their labor for money, creating whatever goods were desirable on the beautiful market. Now, this marked the creation of enclosures, in which peasants were kicked off the land their family had worked for generations, fenced out of their previous homes. They now worked for wages and had to pay rent. In other words, it was capitalism time. Now, while we're not moving back onto parcels of land owned by feudal lords, much of our lives is spent on apps and in other digital spaces that we do not own. If you do own a digital space, however, just consider signing up for our Patreon. There's a link in the description. We would love to take your money. Now, this often involves digital forms of enclosures, and we're creating value for the owners of these enclosures every time we read the news, catch up with friends, or order dinner. Techno-feudalism describes this cloud-based way of life, where we've become serfs who live on the terrain of Silicon Valley billionaires. And much like the serfs before us, we don't really have a choice, as so much of modern existence requires use of these digital spaces. Like, really think about it. If you were going to throw your phone away, get off the internet, not use apps, like, what would you do? A lot of stuff would be really hard. If you've done that, don't let us know, because you're not here, because you wouldn't be watching this. According to McManahan, Strachan, and Forno, techno-feudalism suggests our preferences are no longer our own. They're manufactured by machine networks. It's underpinned by the theory that the cloud has created a feedback loop that removes our agency. We train the algorithm to find what we like, and then the algorithm trains us to like what it offers. I don't know what this says, but I'm getting this Instagram ad recently that's like, how to be a good dad even if you have ADHD. And it's like, Jesus Christ, you're targeting me with a thing that's like, your specific neurodivergency is making you a bad dad, but you need to do this to be a good dad. It's crazy. So not only are we dependent on cloud-based networks, but the more we engage with them, the more we need them, and the more they sort of own us. Now, you might think that President Musk's recent political activity indicates a desire to use traditional systems of government to gain power, but it's actually the opposite. He's using the government to undermine the very power of government. Trump's even promised him his own government agency, DOGE, or Department of Government Efficiency, with the precise goal of eliminating wasteful government spending. And this plays into the recent trend in which governments are giving up more and more of their power to private tech contractors. This increasingly looks like previously public services, everything from transportation, the post office, libraries, education, becoming enclosed by private corporations. And this isn't an exclusively right-wing move, as the guy who really married big tech to government was none other than Barack Obama, because he hoped that we could change America to be a Silicon Valley hellhole. Lucy Green writes that there was a revolving door between the Obama administration and tech giants. A host of ex-Obama staffers went on to work for Lyft and other Silicon Valley giants, with some helping craft legislation that basically favors digital landlords while taking rights from the new serfs. In other words, it gives companies a lot of power and makes it where if you're a Lyft driver, you don't have real labor rights. It's established an incestuous relationship between government power and tech influence. Green writes that Silicon Valley is now better positioned than most industries to wield political influence, and in ways we have not seen before. It is at once government vendor, collaborator, sponsor, advisor, communicator, rival, and enemy on any given day. More and more government contracts are going to Silicon Valley, especially in military and communications technology. Consider how NASA, rather than investing in its own R&D, now buys Musk's rockets and satellites. This turns the agency from something that is at least in theory about the public good into a mechanism for enriching Musk. According to Green, tech companies are exacerbating all the pressures on the government, which is both eroding revenues and undermining their strength. And Yanis Varoufakis notes that as with the original enclosures, some form of fence would be necessary to keep the masses out of such an important resource. In the 18th century, it was land that many were denied access to. In the 21st century, it is access to our own identity. This is because just to participate in this new cloud-based kingdom, we're constantly trading our identity and personal data for admission. This data is collected whether you're driving your Tesla or you're posting on the app formerly known as Twitter. And then you're fed ads that imply that if you have ADHD, you can't be a good dad. This means that Musk is completing a project that was initiated and endorsed by Obama and a whole bunch of liberal politicians. So don't say woke crack or anything, guys. I'm saying bad stuff about Obama and those guys, but then you'll just be mad at that. You guys are hard to please. But Musk is going beyond simply trying to make America Silicon Valley again. He's trying to take this project global. It's not dissimilar from the pre-industrial land grabs and expansions that would expand the territories of feudal lords to give them more power and control. France's president recently said this about Musk. 10 years ago, who would have imagined that the owner of one of the world's largest social networks would be supporting a new international reactionary movement and intervening directly in elections, including in Germany? He was joined by Norway's prime minister, who said, "I find it worrying that a man with enormous access to social media and huge economic resources involves himself so directly in the internal affairs of other countries." Sort of like the unmarried friend who gives you marriage advice, or the person without a kid that tells you how to parent. It's just chill. Just chill. It's not your role. Musk has been a major power player in the Russian-Ukraine war via his Starlink satellites, which Ukraine relies on, and which literally give him the power to undermine their war efforts. In recent months, the most alarming part of Musk's European tour of terror has been his support for the far-right Alternative for Germany party. He recently warned the German people,
"Only AfD can save Germany. End of story." And people really need to get behind AfD, and otherwise things are going to get very much worse in Germany.
Okay, let's take a quick look at this article. It's titled, "Musk Says Only AfD Can Save Germany and Talk with German Populist Leader." And if you just read this headline alone and knew nothing else, you might be like, oh, the AfD, that's probably a political party. Populism, that's just someone who claims to appeal to ordinary people. Surely nothing crazy is going on here. But if you were looking at a headline from a different source covering the same story, you could read something like, "Elon Musk to host X event promoting neo-Nazi AfD party ahead of German elections," and think, oh, that's a bad one. And how is it possible that the same story is completely different depending on which source you're getting your news from? Many media organizations, they prioritize clicks over clear, accurate information. They're reducing complex issues to simple sound bites. That article that I just shared, I found that on Ground News, which is where I read my news every day. They're the sponsor of today's video. Their app and website pull stories from across the globe into one place, and it gives you the full picture on every story. This story has been reported by over 300 sources, and we can check out where each one leans politically using their bias distribution chart. You can also check the factuality rating, which scores the reliability of reporting, and even lets you see who owns each source. These factors shape how stories are framed, letting you compare how bias impacts coverage, like we saw in the articles mentioned earlier. Now, one of the things I love about Ground News is their blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately reported by either side of the political spectrum. I don't know about you all, I can get a little trapped in my bubble, following certain people on social media, talking to friends who have similar views as I do, and this feature really helps me step outside that bubble and both discover stories I wouldn't see otherwise, and also see how stories I know about are covered differently. Now, if you want to check it out for yourself, you can head over to ground.news/wisecrack and give it a try. If you use this link, you're going to get 40% off the Vantage plan and get unlimited access to all the features that are going to help you get all the information you need to navigate the news in this increasingly newsworthy time. Now, I think Ground News is doing important work. I do hope that you'll check them out. But for now, let's get back to the show. The party's leader, Alice Weidel, used their conversation to equate Hitler and the Nazis with contemporary communist and socialist, even though Hitler actually put communists into camps.
So he was nothing else than an anti-Semitic socialist.
Yeah.
And we are exactly the opposite. We are a libertarian conservative party. We are wrongly framed the entire time.
This isn't just more of Elon being oddly Nazi adjacent, it's an active continuation of the techno-feudalist project. And this was noted by the Green Party candidate from Germany, who said, with his billions upon billions of dollars and unbridled media power, Elon Musk's support for the AfD is not some ignorant whim. He's emboldening those who want to weaken Europe and its rule of law, the very regulations that limit unchecked power. Now, some of you Musk fanboys might argue that all he's doing is encouraging a more libertarian spirit and a sense of free speech absolutism. But according to political philosopher Gwilym David Blunt, Musk and co. aren't libertarian. They're authoritarian. They're primarily interested in shielding themselves from regulation. They're overlords, wanting to be free of constraint, like feudal overlords of the past, as divine right of kings. They view themselves arbitrarily as geniuses, and we are buying into it one click at a time, affirming their power. And it makes sense that Musk would work to destabilize Europe with its historical social safety nets and more aggressive regulation of tech companies, including the recent Digital Markets Act, which bars companies from monetizing data collected on mobile apps to help advertisers better target individuals. But you might still be wondering, how does any of this end capitalism? Well, let's think back to the transition from feudalism to industrialism, when the enclosure of land turned everything into market relations. The early open access and publicly funded internet was, over the course of the 90s, sold off for commercial interest, and eventually enclosed by tech companies that consolidated services to extract maximum data and profit from users. But now the shift to techno-feudalism has more to do with power and control than it does market viability. Now, according to Varoufakis, techno-feudalism is qualitatively distinct from capitalism, and thus, as a word, it illuminates crucial aspects of the real world in ways that rentier capitalism, or platform capitalism, or hyper-capitalism cannot. In other words, techno-feudalism breaks from the pure market logic that has driven most tech development until recently. And just like how some of Musk's seemingly erratic political behavior makes more sense in light of the techno-feudalist project, so does his own use of and general encouragement of hate speech. Now, Varoufakis writes, because techno-feudalism's algorithms are known to reinforce patriarchy, stereotypes, and pre-existing oppressions, those who are most vulnerable, girls, the mentally ill, the marginalized, and yes, the poor, suffer the outcome most. In other words, if recklessly using R words and N words and F words on social media reinforces the strength of these platforms, then hey, why not encourage it? And in case you're going to be like, he doesn't, he did the R one. I'm not going to say it, but he did it. We recently saw this with Mark Zuckerberg pulling diversity programs out of Meta, along with their content moderation program, which now allows for hate speech. And Zuckerberg has explicitly connected these moves with a renewed call for masculinity and aggression in corporate culture.
It's one thing to say we want to be kind of like welcoming and make a good environment for everyone. And I think it's another to basically say that masculinity is bad.
And it shouldn't shock us that folks like Zuckerberg, Bezos, Musk, Mark Andreessen are all getting in line to serve in Trump's anti-woke army. Now, Varoufakis writes that bigotry is techno-feudalism's emotional compensation for the frustrations and anxieties we experience in relation to identity and focus. He notes that even the most diligent content moderation can't stem all this hate because algorithms optimize for cloud rents, which flow more copiously from hatred and discontent. It's good for business to do hateful stuff, so they're going to keep making it possible to do hateful stuff. Now, Varoufakis also points out that another effect of the techno-feudalist revolution is that we no longer own our own minds. During our working hours, we become cloud proles, putting ourselves into various digital systems. My main one is YouTube. What digital system do you put yourself into? And then when we get home, we become cloud serfs, fueling our own distraction and exploitation. When I'm at home, I still largely fuel YouTube, sometimes other streaming apps, Reddit, Twitter, Instagram. Why don't I read books? I don't know. Now, he writes that while privatization and private equity asset strip all physical wealth around us, cloud capital goes about the business of asset stripping our brains. Whew, take that one in, guys. Cloud capital goes about the business of asset stripping our brains. Where we once both lived and worked on the feudal lord's physical land, the new serfdom takes place in the cloud controlled by the tech overlords, where our minds and very identities are extracted for value. Now, it might feel like we're totally screwed. At this point, that's how I feel. But, according to Varoufakis, the poison might also contain the cure. He writes that collective action is made harder when people have fewer opportunities to come together. But herein lies the great power the cloud capital presents to its potential rebels, a capacity to build coalitions, organize, and take action via the cloud. I guess that's what the comments are for. Get after it. So, the very space that we're forced to work as both unpaid laborers and reproducers of the system is also a space where we can band together to rage against the machine. As Bernie Sanders pointed out in a recent interview with Hassan Piker, the techno-feudal takeover of politics disempowers working people as a whole and hollows out what remains of democracy.
You got control of the media by the few, control of the political system by the few, control of the economy by the few. And if that's not oligarchy, I don't know what oligarchy is.
So as Trump takes office, flanked on all sides by those with a clear techno-feudal agenda, the challenge is creatively using those feudal spaces to organize resistance against our new lords. Okay, please let me know what you think below. If you haven't checked it out yet, there is a link to our Patreon community in the description. It's a great way to support the channel, get early videos with no ads, extra perks, access to our Discord server, things of that nature. If you don't have that and you consider subscribing, liking, leaving a comment, it all really helps us. In the meantime, I don't know, try to be a little less surfy this week, and I'll do the same. I'll see you next time. I have a PhD in philosophy and used to teach college courses on Marxism, and I just failed a quiz in an online class on Marxism, socialism, and communism at Hillsdale College. So either I've gotten dumber, or this course is pedagogically designed not to teach or inform, but to indoctrinate people into a very specific right-wing ideology. One which ultimately argues for a white Christian ethno-state. And because this sort of indoctrination is happening all over the place, today I'm going to look at this specific class so we can get some insight into how educational content is being used as a propaganda machine. Many of the ideas presented in this course were inaccurate, misinformed, or willfully misleading, but the thing that I found most shocking were the parts that I kind of agreed with.
At its core, socialism represents a very humane ideal. It's a system that is driven not by a desire to brutalize people, but to give them a good life.
But then they do stuff like this and imply that Marxists invented being trans.
The first transgender operation was conducted around 1930 in Germany in an institute run by cultural Marxists there.
And listen, that'd honestly be cool, but I looked into the institute they're talking about. It was notably attacked by the Nazis, where they burned all the books. I don't know if you want to be on the same team as the Nazis. And the only connection I could find with Marx was that the Marxist writer Ernst Bloch once rented a room there. So there you go. And this isn't a mistake. The contradictions and inconsistencies of the course gave me some shocking insight into how reactionary thinking works. And what's maybe more shocking is that, like I said before, the whole thing ends with a call for white Christian nationalism.
And here you could look at, say, Federalist 2, where John Jay describes that you have a common people. They are rooted from a common ethnicity, use a common language, have the same religion.
Okay, so let me show you the course. There's 6 lessons, each with a final quiz, and you get a certificate if you complete everything, which I did. So now I'm a graduate of this course. Before we get into it, I want to talk about this video sponsor, Magic Spoon. As I've been getting older, I'm trying to get healthier, and a big part of that is cutting down on sugar, which I know leaves me feeling sluggish and not at my top performance, which is why I'm really excited to tell you about Magic Spoon. Now, you've probably already heard about and tried their really fantastic cereals, but today I want to highlight a couple of their newer goodies, their treats and their granola. Now, their new treats are crunchy, airy, and make for the ideal snack on the go. They contain 11 to 12 grams of protein, 1 gram of sugar, and 1 to 2 grams of net carbs. And their brand new high-protein granola contains 13 grams of protein and 0 added sugar, and delicious flavors like honey almond and peanut butter. Now, my favorite of these is the treats. I spend a lot of time sitting down, staring at a computer. It's easy to forget to eat, and knowing that I have a simple and high-quality snack that's ready to go feels so good, especially because there's so many flavors I get to try. Now, if you want to check out all this awesome new stuff from Magic Spoon, you can use the code WISECRACK or click the link in the description to try Magic Spoon treats or granola today and get $5 off. You can also find Magic Spoon on Amazon or in your nearest grocery store. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their products that it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee online. So if you don't like it for any reason, they're going to refund your money, no questions asked. So click the link in the description to go to magicspoon.com/wisecrack or scan the QR code on the screen. You're going to get $5 off. Now let's get back to the show. Now the first lesson is called The Journalist, Marx, and it opens with the question,
how does a society create and protect human flourishing?
Which they apply to Marx's theory of communism.
The claim that communism leads inexorably to human flourishing must be evaluated.
But soon after this, they make a claim that points to the specter that's haunting the whole course.
The dream itself, complete abolition of human self-interest, is completely at odds with human nature.
But see, the problem is they don't define human nature, which then means that they can't evaluate Marx's ideas against this definition. Again, a definition that doesn't exist. Am I most charitable? I guess I would assume that their definition of human nature is some libertarian notion in which we're all private entities driven by our own self-interest. The course also teaches us that Marx and Engels' ideas were more vibes than they were facts.
They thought these are not simply our views or our passionately held beliefs, although they were, but these are scientific truths we're talking about.
So basically, when Marx does philosophy and economics, it's just like emotions and opinions. But when these guys, the ones teaching the course, do it, well, then we're doing facts and logic. And when they do try a more substantial critique, it honestly feels like a lazy misreading.
Marx's idea was freedom requires us to liberate ourselves from our own individuality and to see ourselves in terms of the larger community that we are part of. And that communal freedom, which is a kind of collective freedom, it requires what we would call today the abolition of private liberty.
Now here he's trying to be cute by rephrasing the abolition of private property as the abolition of private liberty. The implication is that Marx wants us to give up our individual freedom and ourselves for communal freedom. But as Marx himself writes in the German ideology, only in community with others has each individual the means of cultivating his gifts in all directions. Only in the community, therefore, is personal freedom possible. Now, the reason that Marx can think about both freedom and dependence is because he is a dialectical thinker, which is something that this course never mentions.
Freedom means freedom from religion. We have to abolish religion itself in order for there to be true freedom. And that can only take place in terms of this radical transformation of the human condition in which we stop thinking ourselves as individuals and start thinking of ourselves as part of this other larger whole.
Now, I've talked about this a lot in the last couple of years, but Marx's critique of religion is really a critique of the underlying conditions of oppression and alienation that lead folks to seek hope in religion. You know, this is the opiate of the masses stuff. Marx isn't saying that religion is bad. Marx is saying that the world is bad, the world is soulless, and it leads to the need for religion. And his vibe is like, guys, what if the world was just great and we didn't need that? What if the conditions of social and economic life were such that you didn't have to go to church to feel good? You still go to church if you want, but you wouldn't have to. That's the idea here. Now, another thing I've talked about before is how Marx's thought is dialectical. And this describes when thoughts and concepts develop through internal or external contradictions. Thinking dialectically means that we don't just think about concepts or ideas like they're in a vacuum, isolated from everything else. You know, we think about the relations between seemingly opposed concepts or ideas. And this makes thought way more active and makes concepts way more active because we're thinking about them in relationship to context, material conditions, historical conditions, things of that nature. But this course ignores the possibility that you could be both more dependent and more free. I'll give you an example. Let's say that you live in a country that makes you pay more in taxes, but then also gives you the freedom of healthcare as a human right. So in a sense, you might feel less free in that you're paying more in taxes, but you are more free in so much as you are guaranteed health care. So this means that if you break your leg when you're skiing, well, you know that you're not going to have your life financially ruined because of medical bills. You have the freedom to go skiing, knowing that even if you screw your leg up, you'll be okay. That's why I never want to go skiing. It's just too high of a risk. You know that skiing is like the #1 source of injuries for recreational sport activities? I'm just saying, skiing's too dangerous. Now, in the course notes, they write that because religion and the family had both been perverted by capitalism, Marx believed they needed to be eradicated to reach a true communist society. And they somehow interpret this stuff, especially the family part, from this passage.
Abolition of the family. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private gain. The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital.
So a team of distinguished academics read that and they thought, yep, they think that the family absolutely should be abolished. But according to political scientist Heather Brown, Marx and Engels argued that the family in its bourgeois form, based primarily on the management and transfer of property, was in a state of dissolution. The material conditions that had led to this form of the family were disappearing among the proletarians because they had no property to give to their children. And here it's basically saying that the family in bourgeois society really just amounted to a mechanism of wealth and property transfer. And in acting as if Marx wants to destroy the family out of some hatred of tradition or God, the professors teaching the course are distracting from the fact that Marx and Engels want to abolish the family as a means of wealth transfer, labor production, and the subjugation of women. In effect here, they're talking about what the family was at this particular moment in time. And this is another instance of the course really failing to understand Marx's dialectical method, in which concepts are developed dynamically in light of existing social relationships. This leads them to miss the fact that Marx is not talking about the textbook or dictionary definition of family, but instead family as it existed as a social category during the particular time period of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. And this failure, well, it plagues the entire course because they ignore the fact that via this method, things written in 1848 wouldn't uncritically apply to our situation in 2025. Again, if we're thinking dialectically, concepts, ideas, all of these things are related to historical, material, and economic conditions. Our historical, material, and economic conditions now are different than they were 200 years ago, but the course doesn't seem to acknowledge that. Now, they end the Marx lesson with this.
Generally speaking, the doctrines have had the most appeal to university students, college students, the comfortable, the well-off, those who really have the time to read and, of course, to process and then propagate these ideas on their own.
This comes after a big chunk of the video where they argue that Marx was wrong because the working class didn't agree with him. And when they talk about the working class, they seem to just mean like, soot-faced mine workers who don't have time for reading books and stuff. But they're missing the point here because for Marx, working class describes people who do not have access to capital and then exchange their labor for money. People that go to do a job, and when you do the job, you get money for the job that you do, right? For example, most teachers, nurses, chefs, journalists, plumbers, and YouTubers are working class. Most people are working class. If you're watching this video right now, you're probably working class. And if you're not, I would love to tell you about our Patreon community. There's a link to it in the description. It's a great way to support the channel. When you sign up, you're going to get videos early with no ads, access to our Discord community, a bunch of other perks. It's a great thing to do with your inherited wealth. So consider that. It's a way that you can pay for your sins. And I'm really not sure why they're saying that it's bad that the people who agree with Marx are people who read his books. It's like saying, only people who have actually eaten Al Pastor tacos think they're good, so they're bad. What? Doesn't make sense. And this implies that first, people who actually engage with these ideas take them seriously and find them valuable. And second, that labor conditions are such that many working people don't even have time to read, which I don't know. seems like a problem. Now, I took the quiz at the end of this one, and it created a real dialectical tension between my desire to get an A and my desire to be correct. But for now, I want to jump ahead to the final lesson, but I don't want you to feel lost. So here's a quick summary of lessons 2 through 5. Lesson 2 teaches us that Lenin was bad, and since he read Marx, well, Marx was bad too. Lesson 3 teaches us that Stalin was bad, and since he read Marx, you guessed it, Marx was bad too. Lesson 4 teaches us that gulags are bad, and that some guys who built gulags read Marx, so Marx is bad too, but also there's an Austrian economist who donated his library to Hillsdale College. He said Marx is bad, but he's good. Lesson 5 teaches us that Mao was bad, and since Mao read Marx, Marx was bad too, which brings us to lesson 6, which teaches us that public school teachers, corporate DEI consultants, and Bernie Sanders want to destroy Western civilization and make you do orgies.
What Marx really deep down wanted the most was the complete destruction of Western civilization.
If you've ever done an orgy, let us know in the comments. The logical leaps made here are pretty astonishing. You know, they're going from Marx to Lenin to Stalin to Mao to college professors, DEI programs, trans people.
But what seemed to have happened is that all of the Marxians, they did not just wither away and die. They, in fact, fled to academia. And in academia, they continue to spread these ideas and refine these ideas.
Of course, academics don't spread Marxist ideas as a project of ideological warfare. And again, I used to be a philosophy professor who taught at a very left-leaning department. I taught courses on Marxism, and that's just not what we did. You know, the idea is to introduce students to texts and ideas that are important and let them think about them for themselves. You know, academics study these ideas because they're important to the history of political philosophy and relevant to contemporary crises. But this course is invested in constructing a conspiratorial narrative in which everything bad is somehow connected to Marx.
Critical theory becomes the dominant political philosophy of the latter half of the 20th century.
And as you see in the final lesson, they're really drawing some very thin connections. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, critical theory refers to the work of those from the Frankfurt Institute of Social Research in pre-war Germany. Later, a bunch of these people moved to America. It's associated with thinkers like Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse. And the basic deal there is they were blending Marx's work with the work of Freud and other contemporary culture analysts. Okay, probably read some of the stuff. But to say that these theories being taught in university humanities classes made it the dominant political theory of the latter half of the 20th century is a bit rich. And this is the part that really blows my mind. There's no solid evidence that the ideas of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theorists were the most important political theory of the latter half of the 20th century. Guys, the latter half of the 20th century is like Reagan and Thatcher. That's the vibe we had. The vibe was not Adorno and Horkheimer, if only. And the course only really focuses on some of the more sexuality-based theories from these writers, and they read it in a way that tries to convince you that post-war Marxism was all about gangbangs and sexual transgressions and stuff like that.
And it was Marcuse that argues for a white privileged elite, the white radicals, to unite in solidarity with what he called the wretched of the earth. And by that, he meant third world peoples of color. He meant women who were oppressed by a patriarchal system, and he advocated those who were oppressed by gender. He advocates polymorphous perversity to overthrow the old social mores.
Now, I've read a lot of Marx, and I've never had sex. They then connect the dots between Marxism, critical theory, and American liberalism.
The most influential form of Marxism today, it's just what we call today liberalism.
And then they slowly bring in the Christianity stuff.
It provides a sense of meaning and purpose to the children of the upper middle class and of the wealthy. But ultimately it falls hollow. There's no real transcendence there because the very promise of Marxism is a thoroughly profane society, that you'll be free from all the repressive moral constraints. Well, what does that lead to in practice? It leads to thorough meaninglessness, or it is reduced to raw power.
And there's a point in lesson 6, I'm going to show it to you right now, that honestly had me thinking that maybe I was watching a course created by serious academics. I actually tried to get in touch with Kevin Slack, the professor who's talking right here, but he doesn't have an email address listed on his faculty profile, so I couldn't do it. Kevin, if you're watching, DM me or something.
The reason I think that Marxism is so appealing is because of the radical inequalities of wealth that are, to me, indisputable today. How is it that you can defend mere capitalism if it leads to the destruction of the family because we open up a market for every form of degradation that helps to destroy the family?
But right after he acknowledges that Marxism is a legitimate response to the crises of capitalism, there's this hard pivot towards the founding fathers and their sort of veiled Christian nationalism.
People descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government. Very similar in their manners and customs.
Right? And it feels, once you get here, like this is where the whole thing has been leading. To have a truly free nation, well, you need people with the same ancestors, presumably European, speaking the same language, probably English, practicing the same religion, Christianity, probably Protestantism, along with similar manners and customs, which I guess means they wear the same types of pants and eat the same sort of food. It all boils down to, and I'm not exaggerating here, a white Christian ethno-state.
Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people.
They think that the basis of a nation is everyone has to be from the same place, speak the same language, and have the same religion. Oh, there's a place that's like that right now. Things aren't going well there. I'm not going to say what it is. Also, it's like no wonder these guys were so mad at Stalin, because, Stalin helped defeat someone who was also trying to create their ideal white Christian ethno-state in Germany. It boils down to this. America only works if everyone in the country is both moral and religious. Got it.
The irony for all these socialists is that the goals that they're trying to achieve can actually be achieved through liberty, through simple economic and political freedom.
And again, that's their response to the entire tradition of Marxism and critical theory. It's wrong and bad because it doesn't say that America is a place where everyone has the same religion and morality. God, I don't know. If it all boils down to that, why have the whole class leading up to it? You know what I mean? Why have the whole thing? To suck time away from me. You guys know I have a child. I watched her running around the room playing as I had my headphones on and I watched this course and took notes on it. I'll never have that time back. I do it for you. Or, as I might argue, the irony here is that socialism, at least as articulated by Marx and those in the Marxist tradition, is about creating the conditions for freedom and human flourishing outside of the constraints of private economic markets. But more seriously, offering freedom to markets and people alike is precisely the problem for those in the Marxist tradition.
Socialism is always fundamentally the negation of liberty.
Because when we do, markets often end up being more free than people. I'll give you guys a really clear example here. I'm in Los Angeles right now. We're still in the middle of some historic wildfires. And the thing that's happened in the wake of people losing their entire lives is that real estate agents in Los Angeles are jacking up rents, a lot. This has been in the papers and stuff. Because what they're basically doing is taking advantage of a free market to jack up the rents because they know right now people that just lost their houses are incredibly desperate and will pay anything for a place for their families to live. That's what we're getting when we have a free market. It's the freedom to be economically exploited after your house burns down in an ecological disaster. Sounds great. And this all boils down to this, right? That socialism, which is a theory that they never really formally define or critique in this course, is antithetical to liberty, which again is an idea that they don't formally explain or define, which really means that these dudes, they just want to scaremonger you into thinking that any system other than a Christian, capitalist, European, libertarian thing is inevitably going to lead to you having to go to the gulags. And what really bums me out here is that free, open educational content, which I think is good, is being used to push a very specific and right-wing propaganda without really paying any attention to the scholarship or the figures being discussed. that's it for this one. Please do leave a comment and let me know what you think about all of this. I'd love to read those things. If you're a member of the ruling class, please consider signing up for our Patreon. There's a link in the description. And for the rest of you, thank you so much for being here, and I hope you have enough free time in your working week to do some reading. You know, you deserve it. In the meantime, take it easy. I'll see you later. Okay, friends, family, faithful followers, today I am here to proclaim God is still not dead. You know, first the philosophers tried to kill him.
That is why, Wheaton, you will find the most committed atheists were once Christians. But we took the blinders off. We saw the world for what it truly is.
Then the school board tried to execute him, but Clarissa saved him.
You stood up for what you believed in, and you held on to your faith. I don't know anybody that would have done that. You know, they were hoping to make an example of you, when instead you became an inspiration.
Then the state tried to silence his most stalwart mouthpiece.
And faith in God may not be as popular on campus as it once was, but people still have a right, a fundamental human right to express their beliefs.
Then the liberals tried to kill God's most sacred doctrine, homeschooling, but the big guy had other plans.
Your God, your book, they're in the way. They're in the way of moral relativism. They're in the way of calling good evil and evil good.
And today I'm here to check out God's Not Dead 5, In God We Trust. A movie that dares to ask, what if a political movement fueled by Christian nationalism, delusional fears about socialism, and a deep love of capitalism could somehow gain power in America's ultra-liberal political climate? What if that happened? Guys, I'm going to be honest with you, this one is a lot, and not just because of the subplot, where there's this liberal, played by Scott Baio, who fat shames the mother of his child.
No.
You can't wait.
Did I what?
Put on a couple of pounds?
No, I'm...
They don't really make it clear if he knows it's his kid, but then he just keeps inviting her on a trip to France over and over, because I guess liberals all just want to go to France and bang their ex or something.
When it's over, I am heading to the south of France. Would you like to join more?
But while these movies are, of course, fun to have a laugh at, they also give us a window into the unconscious of American right-wing evangelicalism, which is increasingly important at a time when, you know, despite what these movies might have you think, right-wing Christians wield more and more political power. Now, this installment clearly lays out the political theology of American right-wing evangelicals. And it offers us a glimpse of how they see themselves, you know, a persecuted minority having their traditional way of life ripped away from them, and the world around them, you know, a liberal hell run by scholars and academics that want a Maoist-style elimination of religion.
They called it the Cultural Revolution.
So I'm going to show you some of the film, at least some of the most instructive clips, focusing on both the Christian persecution complex that drives the whole thing, and we're also going to look at how the film's ideological message ultimately seems way more shaped by a commitment to American liberalism than it does to Christian theology. Guys, I know you're used to seeing me dressed like I'm an aged college student or something, but occasionally I like to dress up and go out on the town. But there's one thing I've always been hesitant about, which is not just looking nice, but smelling nice. And that's why today I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Scentbird. Now, Scentbird is a fragrance subscription service with a mission to empower each and every person to express themselves through scent. This month I got a few different fragrances. My favorite is this one. It's the Cacao Porcelana by Atelier Materi. If I said that wrong, I'm sorry. This is very classy for me. And on the card included with my box right here, I can see that this one has notes of white cacao, rum, light tobacco, patchouli, and tonka bean. And to me at least, yeah, it smells like sophisticated, warm, woody, and I think it's perfect for this time of year, and I'm definitely going to be wearing this one in any winter parties or events I go to. Now, one of the scents I got in my subscription this month is Dolce by Rosie Jane. It smells like vanilla, hinoki wood, and nude musk. Now, I never would have gotten that on my own, but I know it smells really good, kind of subtle. I can imagine this for like a, you know, classier evening of drinks and small plates. Now, you might be wondering, Michael, why would I need a fragrance subscription when I can just go and buy each fragrance individually? And I'm going to tell you why. Now, first of all, if you were going to buy the full-size bottle of this fragrance, it would run you about $250. And when you're looking around trying to find your signature scent, that's a pretty steep price tag. But with Scentbird, you get to try your first fragrance for only $8. And then the next month, you're only going to pay $16.95. You can change your fragrance every month. With over 700 fragrances to choose from, Scentbird is perfect for figuring out what you love. That's why I really enjoyed it, because I can try out different stuff, figure out what scent I like, and then just order more of that. I don't waste money on a big bottle. So if you're ready to give Scentbird a try for yourself, scan the QR code or use the code Wisecrack55 off to get 55% off your first month at Scentbird. You'll get your first fragrance for just $8, and the next month will be only $16.95. Again, the code is Wisecrack55 off, or you can just scan the QR code right here. And now, let's get back to the show. You'll be smelling good for it. Film critic David Ehrlich provides an insightful take on this persecution complex, writing that these movies are fundamentalist propaganda aimed at people who are convinced their religion is under attack in this country just because it doesn't exempt them from the Constitution. At a time when anti-Semitic hate crimes are on the rise and America is openly hostile towards its own Muslim community, to say nothing of the Trump administration's dehumanizing attitude towards immigrants, people of color, and the LGBTQ population, God's Not Dead contends that white Christians are the real victims here. Okay, so let's get started and check out the latest installment in this fundamentalist propaganda film series, God's Not Dead 5.
Without God, we're mired in the material, that flat world that tells us only what the senses perceive. Without God, there is a coarsening of the society. And without God, democracy will not and cannot long endure.
And before we get started, in case you're wondering, Michael, I know you've covered God's Not Dead 1, 2, 3, and this is 5. What's missing? 4. I missed that one last year, but I did a full reaction video to the entire movie that we put up over on Patreon. So all of our patrons, you will have access to that. And even if you don't want to sign up for our Patreon, you could go and just get that video. So there's a link in the description. Check it out. Okay, so the plot of this movie is thinner than the remaining hairs on the top of my head. So what you need to know is this, right? There's a conservative candidate for Congress in Arkansas, and he dies right before the election, and this seemingly guarantees that his liberal opponent is going to win, and this is scary because the liberal says stuff like, look, here, I'll show you.
The passing of Rick West may allow us to catch up with the rest of the modern world. I have always said that religious superstition has no place in influencing our laws and government. So, here's to enlightenment, reason, and reshaping our nation's core.
Cheers. Cheers. Okay, so their vision here is that the liberals in America are a bunch of like business guys in suits who are all pretty tall and like drinking scotch. And if you heard what he said there, it was that religious superstition has no place in influencing our laws and government. So here's to enlightenment, reason, and reshaping our nation's core. I think the enlightenment and reason thing are very funny here because it is implying that enlightenment and reason, big parts of the Enlightenment and the sort of thinking that fueled modern philosophy, political theory, science, things of that nature, is somehow bad or anti-religious. And one of the biggest philosophers, most important philosophers of the Enlightenment would be someone like Immanuel Kant, right? And Kant does think that faith isn't exactly tenable with, his view on philosophy, but he does think that you can have faith within the limits of reason. He thinks there's absolutely a place for faith, and the whole point that he would argue is basically that, philosophy is one thing, and we can't use philosophy to prove that God exists, but if you want faith, that's totally cool. We have a Christian existential philosopher, Soren Kierkegaard, who kind of thinks that there's a dialectical relationship between faith and reason. It's not that reason or enlightenment logic sort of devours faith and divinity. It's that we use the two things to understand each other. And we've made multiple videos about this over the years, so I'm not going to get too into it. One of them is on It's Always Sunny, and I like that one a lot. But I think right off the bat, we see this weird philosophical misreading of the entire tradition and a weird reading of what liberals are like. Now, I don't have time to dwell on this next part too much, but I do want you to see the opening credits montage, because we have scenes of MLK Jr. and JFK, and then we have needles they're shoved into arms, there's churches on fire, there's Ronald Reagan. It's a lot of stuff, and it's really weird, and I have nothing to say about it other than what were they thinking.
You see those statues and those monuments out there? They're trying to tell us something. They're saying, don't forget about us. Don't forget about the battles that we fought.
Okay, the conservatives in the movie are freaked out because if that guy wins, then the Democrats will have control of the House, which means one thing and one thing only.
If the House flips, hello socialism.
And of course, there's only one man who could save the day here. It's our buddy, Pastor Dave. If you've seen these movies before, he's in all of them. And when we catch up with him, he's reeling from finding out that a women's center that his church runs is getting shut down by the government because the residents read the Bible together. Because again, we're imagining in America where the government is like shutting down community programs because people are reading the Bible. But then we have this conversation with him and one of his fellow pastors who's from China. Let's check this out.
What was true? Churches were destroyed, Christians were persecuted and put into camps. Countless were killed. A similar revolution seems to be brewing here in America, David. It may look different, but the essence is the same.
Okay, so real quick, he's implying that the principles of Mao's Cultural Revolution, I'm sure a lot of you know about that, are analogous to what's currently happening in America, and that because of that, that's why God wants Pastor Dave to run for Congress in Arkansas. Now, to be clear here, the Cultural Revolution in China, a lot of very gnarly stuff happened. Like religious leaders and institutions from all faiths were persecuted. Monks and nuns were imprisoned. Buddhist temples were burned. Texts were burned. Monks were beaten and killed. And today in China, like Muslims suffer through mass surveillance, internment, and torture. The state has, state-certified Christian churches. There's also underground networks of churches. But that's all to say, there's not really an analog between the Cultural Revolution in China and the current state of religious freedom in China and what's happening in America right now. And I would say it's reckless. I would say it's pretty reckless to make that comparison. But this is what they want to do, right? They want to convince people, they want to convince you, the viewer, that you should be afraid because a Cultural Revolution style persecution of white Christians is coming for you. As Ehrlich writes, so far as the God's Not Dead cinematic universe is concerned, Christians are under constant attack. Heathen liberals, having grown so intolerant towards Jesus and his teachings that simply going to church on Sunday is enough to make someone feel like Joan of Arc. And I feel like that scene really embodies this and then sets the tone for the persecution narrative that drives so much of this film. Okay, so Pastor Dave at this point decides to run for Congress, and then this woman who we're meant to believe has a dark past becomes his campaign manager, and one of their first big stops is going to Mike Huckabee's live talk show. And I'm going to be honest, I assumed that this was made up for the movie, but then I Googled it to be sure, and it turns out this is a real show that exists. Recent guests include the guy from Oklahoma who made the Trump Bible a mandatory text in AP history, the lady who played the mom on Everybody Loves Raymond, and Dog, the bounty hunter, and here, Pastor Dave. So let's see how his appearance on Huckabee goes.
You're going to get a lot of questions about your faith.
Or about how your son's killed a dog.
Well, I'm not quite sure why. My job as a congressman is to represent the people, not to impose my faith on them.
Stick to the script.
Having said that,
that's the campaign manager.
I'm not sure how someone's sense of morality doesn't act as a guidepost in public service.
What about separation of church and state?
These days, separation of church and state has been reduced to a catchphrase.
Bunch of hotties in that crowd.
I guess what I'm trying to say is, we're all made of both a mortal body and an immortal soul. And as long as we're still breathing, where do we draw that line?
That seems like a really weird thing to say on news. We're all made of a mortal body and an immortal soul. And the church and state stuff, we're going to see more of this, but I want to flag this now because it's a theme in this movie, it's a theme in the other movies, and there's this obsession, of course, with the idea that the state wants to devour the church in America, that the state wants to destroy religion. He also makes this comment about how we're made of a mortal body and an immortal soul. I'm just going to say that I think that is a weird thing to say in an interview in a context like that. It's also weird that he says it in such a matter-of-fact way. But that said, everything up until that point about, ethics coming from religion that inform one's politics, that's just a normal thing that happens in America on, as Mike Huckabee said, both sides of the aisle.
I have the great advantage of my faith, Catholic social doctrine, and my political views coincide. It's about you are your brother's keeper.
So framing it again as America being a country where you couldn't possibly be a successful politician that was openly religious is just nuts. It's just nuts, you know? You want to know a politician who's openly religious? How about the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance?
And this is one of the great tricks that I think the sexual revolution pulled on the American populace, which is this idea that, like, well, okay, these marriages were fundamentally, you know, they were maybe even violent, but certainly they were unhappy, and so getting rid of them and making it easier for people to shift spouses like they change their underwear, that's going to make people happier in the long term.
We made a video recently about that. You could check out a video about J.D. Vance's faith. It's not at all scary, but because this interview goes bad, the campaign manager then makes him do a podcast interview with his opponent, Kane. So let's check that out. It's a fun one.
Founding fathers were clear about their intentions concerning the separation of church and state. It wasn't so much about keeping religion out of the government. It was more about keeping the government out of religion.
Well, this sounds more like your interpretation.
I will add, Christians who are politically active must be led by biblical principles and values, and not by party affiliation.
Oh, so now you're saying that these biblical principles of yours would influence your decision-making?
Of course.
Okay, I've never been to Arkansas. I'm going to admit that right now. It's just very wild that, again, this movie paints a picture of a world where even in like deeply red southern states, you couldn't possibly be a Christian. They're painting this picture for us where America is a world where there's persecution against white Christians, and the whiskey-swilling liberals love the Enlightenment, they hate religion, and they love scholars and academics. And this plays into a lot of conspiratorial thinking in America right now about how scholars and academics are secretly ruining the country and the political fabric of it with postmodernism or Marxism or whatever. But it's continuing to paint the picture of a world that doesn't exist. And I think some of the stuff Pastor Dave says here, we saw him say in the last interview as well with our boy Huckabee, about the, you know, connection of Christianity and religion to America's foundational principles, is pretty incoherent, but we'll talk about that more later. So let's keep it moving. Okay, so he has this disastrous podcast interview, but then they show a montage where Pastor Dave goes up in the polls, which is weird. But then after he goes up in the polls, they also tell us that no one has seen him before.
Well, you better get some rest, because tomorrow will be the first time most people have ever seen you.
Okay, and then right after this, we now get the first formal debate between Pastor Dave and his satanic liberal opponent, Kane.
The role of government is to make lives better. Why do you have a problem with that?
I don't, but I do have a problem with big government. It spreads like a cancer.
Oh, please. Government allocates.
Big government spreads like a cancer.
Yes, but to give, the government must first take. It's a cycle that breeds dependency, not solutions.
I couldn't vote for a man in his 50s that does bleached tips on his part down the middle hair. He looks like a skateboarder from 1997, maybe a rollerblader. We're going to jump back into this, but I want to stop here. Okay, so the bad guy says government should make lives better, but then Dave says when government does stuff, it spreads like a cancer. And, you know, he says, but to give, the government must first take. He's basically saying that they're going to make socialism happen, right?
If the house flips, hello socialism.
Now, I think we can understand this by looking at some shifts that have taken place. It's going to sound nerdy, guys, but stick with me. In the history of Christian theology and thought. According to Daniel Bell, who's a theologian, there's a priority of the good over the right in more historical accounts of theology. Here's what this means. That the ethical concern for Christians is a notion of the good that makes everyone's life good, and that is more important than your or my individual rights. And this, of course, comes out of people like Plato and Aristotle, gets picked up by people like Aquinas. And I think that what this movie shows us is that a shift happens, right? Kind of post-Enlightenment, liberalism kicks in, and we live in a society, America's like this, where rather than the common good being the aim of our moral and political activity, instead what matters is the rights of individuals. Now, in some of the theology I read for this, and yeah, guys, I read some theology books, it seems to be the case that the more biblical way of doing this is focusing on the common good, and this whole notion of the individual right is just American liberalism put in a churchy package, and most of this movie seems to be that. Bell says, this classical vision of justice carried the day for over a millennium when developments associated with the birth of modernity and the ascendancy of liberal political philosophy, the Enlightenment, gave rise to a host of competing theories of justice erected upon a very different vision of society. Here's why this is interesting. In the movie, the bad guy says that the Enlightenment is good, so we think that the Enlightenment is bad.
Here's to enlightenment.
But then Pastor Dave, in focusing on this individualist sort of way of doing Christian politics, is operating in a firmly post-Enlightenment paradigm, where the way he thinks about the relationship between the church, state, and politics has way more to do with, post-Enlightenment American liberalism than it does classic Christian theology. Boom! I got him, guys. My wife's like, what are you reading? I'm like, theology. And she's like, you better not become a Christian again. You better not. And I was like, why not? And she's like, because I'll put you in a camp and kill you. And I was like, holy... My wife was like, this is America now. I'm going to kill a Christian and come back and make dinner for our child with blood on my face.
Let's pivot to a subject that affects all of our viewers.
Now we get to a real issue.
Healthcare. Millions of Americans are left without
it. It's a real issue.
Senator, what would your solutions be?
Well, yes, I think that health care is a right and not a privilege. We depend on government action to provide it.
Kane's a Medicare for all guy.
Pile on more debt. Senator, we need solutions that empower people, not bankrupt our country.
You don't know anything about the debt.
I know we should spend less.
Well, so you would deny people health care because of the cost?
That's not what
That's your Christian charity?
When he says, you don't know about debt, and he says, we should spend less. Okay, but a few things here, right? We get this question of healthcare, which I think is really important because it gets at the sort of materiality of this Christian ethic. It's funny that they can't decide, by the way, if Kane is like an evil corporate Democrat or if he's Bernie Sanders. But it's also interesting that this movie posits that offering health care to people, irregardless of their station in life, is unchristian, and not giving people health care is good because it doesn't bankrupt the country because debt is bad. And there's another quote from Bell, the theologian I was talking about a second ago, that I think is helpful here. He says that liberalism reimagines society as a teeming mass of individuals, each with their own interest, ends, and conceptions of what constitutes the good life. Consequently, justice was reconfigured in contemporary parlance. Now the right is given priority over the good. So what we see here is an instance where Kane posits that healthcare is like a fundamental human right. It's a fundamental good that everyone deserves, which kind of goes in line with classical Christian thought. And then we have Pastor Dave, who says that healthcare is bad because it takes away people's individual rights, which is just liberal economic logic. It's not like a Christian thing.
We need efficient, affordable care.
And where do we get that? Your collection plate? You see, that's the crux of this, Dan. He and people like him, they think that their beliefs should dictate our laws.
Christians don't believe that.
And that's wrong.
Christians don't believe that.
Yes,
Christians don't believe that.
The point, Senator. Our nation was founded on Christian principles.
Christian principles. It seems we've heard that one before. Well, I hate to break it to you, but the idea that this is a Christian nation, that's more myth than history.
Okay, so for this video, I did some reading. I read one book by a pastor named Greg Boyd called The Myth of a Christian Nation. He's like a pretty normal pastor, and he wrote a whole book about how this whole thing is a myth. There's another thing I found, and this is from the scholars Knoll, Hatch, and Marsden wrote a book called The Search for Christian America, and they say this: a careful study of the facts of history show that early America does not deserve to be considered uniquely, distinctively, or even predominantly Christian, if we mean by the word Christian a state of society reflecting the ideals presented in Scripture. There is no lost golden age to which American Christians may return. In addition, a careful study of history will also show that evangelicals themselves were often partly to blame for the spread of secularism in contemporary American life. We feel also that careful examination of Christian teaching on government, the state, and the nature of culture shows that the idea of a Christian nation is a very ambiguous concept, which is usually harmful to effective Christian action in society. Again, these aren't radical liberal leftist guys. These are like Christian scholars and theologians arguing that. So along with this persecution narrative, right, we see them basically saying not only are Christians persecuted now, this used to be ours. Like, we used to have this place. It was a Christian nation. It was ours. And then they took it from us. So now we need to take it back. I'm going to talk like a kid now. A cool kid would say, it's giving 1930s Germany. That's what I think it's giving. I can't get away with saying that, but that's how the kids talk. Okay, there's so much I have to summarize here, but after that debate, the campaign manager gets tricked into publishing a fake story about Cain, and everyone gets mad at her, and then Dave gets forced to leave the church because they were mad at him, and he tries to drop out, but then this guy who's played by the actor that got fired from Grey's Anatomy for calling someone the F-slur tells him that God wants him to run. We also find out that Scott Baio is the father of the campaign manager's son, and then there's this girl with the dragon tattoo person, and she pops up, but then she's not in the movie again.
Something's not right, Lottie. It feels wrong.
Which all gets us to the final showdown, the big debate right before the election, and we know it is serious because Pastor Dave swaggers across the stage, Bible in hand, and our guy's kind of cooking here, so let's get into it.
Would become if we allow them to eliminate religious freedoms in Christianity.
You're playing the God card
Think
here
China,
now. Maybe you haven't
North
heard.
Korea,
God is not on the ballot.
European socialist
Do you
countries.
hear yourself now?
European socialist countries. I love this so much because he's talking about how religious freedoms are going to be removed in America. It's just a made-up thing. Christianity is being attacked in America, made-up thing. And then he gives his examples of like where we're headed. China. Sure, China does have restrictions on religious freedom. He's right. North Korea. I don't know anything about religion in North Korea, but I'm sure it's not great. European socialist countries, dog. You can go to church in Denmark. You can go to church in Sweden. In Denmark and Sweden, you can go to church, then go to the doctor for free, then probably, get on a bike that the government gives you and ride on your safe bike lane to go get a croissant with like one of your 3 gorgeous spouses you met in an IKEA cafe or something like that. My point here being that they're really telling on themselves when they're trying to say that European socialist countries are bad and scary and irreligious. And this is also important because, again, in the theological tradition, there is an emphasis on a Christian ethic being congruent with forms of socialism. So this is a quote right here from Leonardo Boff, who's a Brazilian theologian. It says, "Christian thinking is more nearly congruent with socialist ideas than capitalist ones. It is not a matter of creating a Christian socialism. It is a matter rather of being allowed to say that the concept of socialism, provided that it is really fulfilled and realized, makes it possible for the Christian to live the humanitarian divine ideal of his or her faith more completely." So again, it's just to say that they're making stuff up, they're scaremongering, and they're trying to like distract people from truths that are in their own tradition. And obviously how this movie's going to end. You know that he's going to it's going to be good for Dave, but we'll get there.
You call it interference. I call it a caring government that provides for its citizens. After all, do unto others. Isn't that the main message of Christianity? Is it not?
No. I think it is. I think Jesus says it all boils down to this: love your neighbor as yourself and love your God with all your heart, mind, strength, or whatever. It's literally in the Bible.
Central to the teachings of Jesus is Jesus.
What does that even mean? Again, I read a lot of theology stuff for this. I didn't have time to get into all of it. If you want me to talk more about it, bug me and I'll do a stream or something like that. Reading a theologian, again, they talked about how, according to Thomas Aquinas, one of the main theologians of the whole thing, medieval dude, it says charity is the form of the virtues, charity is the form of justice. The gist there being that, embodying Jesus in this sense is living a life of charity and stuff like that. So it's really weird that in the movie, again, the bad liberal said, isn't Christianity about loving your neighbor and doing unto others? And then the good Christian is like, no.
Central to the teachings of Jesus is Jesus.
Okay, their social ethic isn't about actually changing the world in a positive way. It's about adhering to the right set of metaphysical principles. So the point isn't to live like Jesus or embody those moral principles. It's just I'm on the good guy's team. I agree that he is the good one.
The only reason Jesus' teachings of love thy neighbor resonates is because he was the Son of God, the creator of the universe. Without that minor detail, Jesus would just be another false prophet.
It's wild, but Dave's really about to get cooking.
Why is it every 4 years we have to watch a politician take Jesus off their shelf, find a Bible verse that they found on someone else's Instagram page, and use just a piece of it?
I gotta say it, these are Trump guys, right? This guy, all the people made the movie, they're Trump guys, and they're critiquing politicians that once every 4 years take the Bible off the shelf. We could put the clip in this video where they ask Trump what his favorite Bible verse is, and he's just it's very personal.
I'm wondering what 1 or 2 of your most favorite Bible verses are and why.
I wouldn't want to get into it because to me that's very personal. When I talk about the Bible, it's very personal, so I don't want to get into verses. I don't want to get into...
There's no verse that means a lot to you that you think about or cite?
The Bible means a lot to me.
I just... Guys, it's crazy to me. This movie came out less than 3 months ago. We just went through this election, and I just don't know anymore. I don't know anymore. If you know anymore, let me know in the comments, because I don't know anymore. Okay, Dave's been cooking for a while, but watch this. Superpower.
Finish it. What comes next?
They're talking about the Declaration of Independence.
Or do you plan to rewrite the Declaration of Independence?
You can't just take the mic and start wandering the stage during a debate.
We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights.
So, like, it's not Christian nationalism, but he's preaching the Declaration of Independence as I'm just saying.
These rights, how did you put it? America's crowning achievement. They don't come from a piece of paper. They come from God. And the biblical idea that all men are created in His image.
This moderator's terrible. In reading about some of this stuff, I was reading this theologian, Stanley Hauerwas, and he quotes another theologian, John Howard Yoder. It says, as Yoder reminds us, the idea that human life is intrinsically sacred is not a specifically Christian thought, but the gospel itself, the message that Christ died for his enemies, is our reason for being ultimately responsible for the neighbor's, and especially the enemy's life. We can only say this to another if we say to ourselves that we cannot dispose of him according to our own will. Here's the point there. Basically, Pastor Dave says, God is important because God kind of gives us the juice to do America. And God helps us do America real good.
We cannot remove God from the fabric of our country without risk of its collapse.
And Yoder is saying that the notion of human life being sacred isn't really specifically Christian. What is specifically Christian is the notion that we are responsible for our neighbors and our enemies, right? We are responsible for the collective good and not protecting our own individual rights. It's a sort of collectivist vision of things versus this neoliberal individualist version of things. There's something at the end that's wild because, well, you'll see.
If all Christians mobilized and voted, do you know what would happen?
Yeah, Trump would win. That's what would happen. If all Christians mobilized and voted, Trump would win. And now stuff's happening, Now the lady from wrestling is going to lead the Department of Education, A guy with some sort of Christian nationalist tattoo might run the military. That's a real thing. Elon Musk and that guy who did the video where he sang Eminem songs.
Go capture this moment and hope they don't catch you. Lose yourself in the music, the moment.
They run the Doge service, which isn't the government but is the government. They want people to come work there for 80 hours a week. It's a lot. And shouts to our editor Jackson. People are worried that America is going to be like the Handmaid's Tale, but it's just this. This is where it's all heading. All I'll say is, again, in reading theology, which was fun, which was a fun thing to do. A thing I saw emphasized a lot was the non-coercive power of Jesus. Stanley Hauerwas writes that Jesus' non-coercive power does not serve by forcing himself on others. He says he's not a military messiah who uses a sword or manipulates the crowds to impose his authority. He does not even fight to defend himself, and he endures the consequences of his opponent's scorn. They're just doing America stuff and saying that it's Jesus stuff. So yeah, in case you didn't get it from here, he wins. He wins, guys. He wins in the movie, and everything's good because he wins. That's how it ends pretty soon after this. So watching this movie in the wake of the 2024 election was rich, because this movie paints white American conservative Christians as a persecuted minority with limited cultural and political influence, precisely at a time when legit white Christian nationalists have more power and influence in American politics than ever before. We made a video about that a few months ago. But I think the more interesting sin of this film, so to speak, is that the movie's politics aren't really Christian in any classical sense. In fact, the version of faith expressed in this film isn't the collective, self-sacrificing, charitable, loving Christianity that we see in some of the theological tradition. It's not one in which the good of all is prioritized over the rights of the individual. Instead, we see a faith deeply entrenched in the very sort of liberalism that the film itself, in the character of Cain, seems to associate with the dangers of Enlightenment rationality. And in this way, the evangelical political theology of the movie is structurally indistinct from America's own neoliberal political ideology. In positing a world in which the goal of Christians is to take over earthly powers, to force their will on others, they're not offering an alternative to an American political project that has already grown quite skilled at forcing its will and way of life on those around around the globe. And according to Stanley Hauerwas, the more Christians try to make Christianity a philosophy sufficient to sustain a society, especially a liberal society, the more we must distort or explain away our fundamental beliefs. Therefore, in the name of sustaining a civilization, Christians increasingly undercut the ability of the church to take a critical stance toward the society. Even when the church acts as a critic in such a context, it cannot be more than a friendly critic, since it has a stake in maintaining the basic structure of society. And he's saying that the whole point of the church is that it's removed from the state. So it operates at a position of critique that it couldn't operate from if it was within the system. Marcia Eileen Hewitt makes a similar argument and writes, whose material interest is being served with particular theories and how openly is it acknowledged? A theology that disregards this question accommodates itself, consciously or not, to the social conditions in which it is contextualized. And I think the theology of this franchise makes a similar mistake, in as much as it doesn't seriously consider the material interests that drive American politics. And in doing so, it just completely accommodates itself to the market and military interest of the American project. This is why the tradition of political theology can be a useful corrective, as it shows how there are theologians and clergy who have thought about the ways in which religion and Christianity can offer a project of positive social change. Now, Hewitt writes that political theology seeks to address the contradictions within religion in order to uncover its inner dialectic of emancipatory and regressive inclinations that helps clarify the contribution of theology to injustice. In this way, political theology aspires to be itself a force of social change. This idea is taken up by Gutierrez as well when he describes liberation theology as part of the process through which the world is transformed. Now, while I doubt the people who make these movies would ever take the time to read some of the theology that explains all of this, I do think it's important that at a time when the sort of people who think this stuff rips are taking political power in America, that we have the tools to call them on their BS. And that does not mean arguing that these movies and the real life Pastor Daves of the world are wrong because
God is dead.
Instead, it means pointing out that these folks aren't even offering perspectives that are intellectually coherent within their own tradition. And that's why I thought it was important for this one to largely look at, theologians and biblical scholars to kind of undercut stuff from within. But in the meantime, do let me know if you think Pastor Dave, because that's all I can think about, guys. In all these movies, he interacts with women and there's vibes. But you're telling me that a charming pastor in small town Arkansas that looks like the singer of Nickelback wouldn't just be crushing it? So let me know about that, and let me know in general what you think in the comments. Just a reminder, this is our last video of 2024. We're going to take a few weeks to recoup, recover, so we can get ready for 2025. Thank you for letting us do that. We'll do some streaming in the meantime, so I'll be there if you miss me. And thank you again to Scentbird for sponsoring today's video. Do not forget to head over and use the code WISECRACK55 off for 55% off your first fragrance. I have mine right here, and it smells delicious. And just a huge thanks to the whole team here. I know that we see this face, but this face is a tiny part of the whole thing. So shout out to Amanda, to Olivia, to Lux, to our friends at Enthusiast, to all of our freelance writers and editors and contributors, to all of our patrons who help keep it going, to all of the Wisecrack Live community members. You truly all make this thing happen. And I'm kind of in shock that starting 2025, it seems like it's still going to be happening. So thank you so much for that. And remember, go to Patreon to check out my full reaction to God's Not Dead 4. And you do not have to join Patreon to watch it. All you got to do is buy that specific video. In the meantime, God bless you and your family, and I'll see you in 2025.
All right, guys, I think we'll leave it here.
What's up, guys? Michael here to use my philosophy degree to examine another piece of the pop culture canon. This time, we're going back to college, a place known for intellectual exploration, social development, and signed atheism pledges due on the first day of class. If that last one didn't bring back any memories, then you didn't attend Hadley University, a fictional college where philosophy is taught by a washed-up Hercules who is really, really mad at God. Super mad.
Yes, I hate God.
This is the setting of God's Not Dead, the first installment in a trilogy produced by the company PureFlix. Like Netflix, but pure. It presents a vision of America in which angry philosophers are on a mission to destroy Christianity. As both a former non-angry philosophy professor and guy who went to Christian summer camp once, you might understand why this film is of particular interest to me. So let's see how this film portrays the brave and potentially nefarious souls who have gone into life-destroying debt to teach philosophy, and this philosopher reacts to God's Not Dead. Before we get into the philosophical nuance of a film that lets you know a character is a radical atheist by the I Love Evolution sticker on the back of her car, I wanted to take a second to tell you about Wisecrack's podcast. Because you're here right now looking deeply into my eyes, I can safely assume you're already a fan of our video content. But what you might not know is that we also make pretty damn good audio content, in my totally unbiased opinion. If you love movies, which I mean, why wouldn't you? You should check out Show Me the Meaning, where our hosts Austin, Raymond, and Ryan explore all the philosophical nuance floating beneath the surface of both current and classic films. And if you're potentially too obsessed with everything going on in pop culture, you should check out Culture Binge, the podcast where we explore the weird, wonderful, and worrisome sides of the cultural zeitgeist. It's hosted by someone you already know and love, more of a brother than a friend, along with Wisecrack's head of content, Alec, and Wisecrack researcher, Serby. So click the links in the description or find them on your favorite podcast app. Now, back to the show. And now for a quick recap. Josh Whedon, no relation to Joss Whedon, is a freshman student who shows up to his Philosophy 150 class where his professor explains that before they begin, everyone must sign a paper that says, God is dead. Josh can't do this because he's a Christian.
I can't do what you want, I'm a Christian.
So the professor insists that unless he wants to lose 30% of his grade, he must convince the entire class that God's not dead.
You'll get 3 sessions, the last 20 minutes of each of the next 3 classes to make your case.
This leads to a series of awkwardly intense showdowns between Josh and his professor, which ends with Josh rocking out at a concert, and the professor, well, not rocking out at all, but more on that later. And while I would love to also explore the film's numerous absurd and often dark plot lines, including a breathtaking performance from Willie Robertson of Duck Dynasty fame.
So, y'all have made a fortune, isn't that right?
We're doing all right. We can certainly buy bigger tires on our trucks and 4-wheelers to get out in the mud with, so life is good.
We're going to stick to the philosophy stuff. Okay, check out the first day of class.
Michel Foucault, Bertrand Russell, Ludwig Feuerbach, Bertolt Brecht. What do they all have in common?
They're all dead.
Well, that would be incorrect. Mr. Dawkins and Mr. Chomsky are still very much alive. Mr.
G-Dog to Rock Trigger.
He said his name was G-Dog.
G-Dog. Well, they are, or were, atheists.
Okay, the G-Dog thing has me shook. Some of these names, Foucault,